Licorice McKechnie. Christina Licorice McKechnie was born on October 2nd, 1945 in Edinburgh, Scotland. As a teenager, she would frequent folk clubs in the city, reading her poetry aloud for others to appreciate. It was here, during one of her visits, that she encountered Robin Williamson, a singer-songwriter and multi-instrumentalist who began his music career by performing in local jazz bands. However, by the mid-1960s, he had formed his own band, the Incredible String Band, a psychedelic folk group that wound up with a loyal following after the release of their second album. They have since been dubbed pioneers of the genre and were especially popular within the British counterculture of the 60s and 70s. Though she formed a bond with Williamson, Licorice remained firm in her plans to leave home and marry Bert Jansch, another Scottish folk musician. However, the wedding never took place. Jansch abandoned Licorice and travelled to Morocco without her. According to Williamson, following this event in 1963, Licorice, quote, fell into my arms. In 1968, Licorice joined the Incredible String Band, most known for her unique, ethereal backing vocals and playing the organ and percussion. Licorice went on to perform with the band at the Woodstock Festival in August of 1969, but by 1972, she and Williamson had grown apart, and after calling it quits on their relationship, she also called it quits on the band, departing a few years before the group dissolved in 1974. This wasn't the end of Licorice's music career, though. In 1974, as a member of the Church of Scientology, she performed on stage at a concert the church held in East Grinstead, a town in West Sussex, England, with several other musicians. Afterwards, she moved to California and joined the Silver Moon Band. At some point, she married another musician named Brian Lambert, though they divorced in the 1980s. In 1977, she reunited with her ex, Robin Williamson, performing with him and his merry band. She's also credited on their album Journey's Edge under the name Licky Lambert. Afterwards, Licorice spent some time performing with the band Woody Woodmansey's U-Boat, an English rock band formed by the drummer Woody Woodmansey, who is perhaps best known as a member of David Bowie's core backing ensemble in the 1970s. Licorice had been a member of the Church of Scientology since the late 1960s, and she wasn't alone. Robin Williamson and Mike Herron, two of her three other bandmates, were also members. The only person who wasn't was bass player and backing vocalist Rose Simpson, who recalled that she never fully committed to the church. In 2020, while speaking with music journalist Richie Unterberger, Simpson noted, quote, membership of the cult suggested greater harmony between us, but also dissolved our commitment to the music. Writing, playing, and performing were now the source of necessary income, and no longer the spiritual or creative center of Mike and Robin's lives. Simpson added that from this point, she began distancing herself emotionally from her bandmates. Quote, as I keep saying, it was a way of life rather than a job, and if they were committed to something and I wasn't, then it splits us up on serious levels. Simpson felt that the church was incredibly cult-like, stating that she felt immense pressure to commit to Scientology like her fellow bandmates. She ultimately parted ways with the band in early 1971, writing that the other Incredible String Band members made it, quote, clear that I must join them in their commitment. I walked out of all of it, on my home, on my future with ISB, and on my friendships of the moment. She also noted that she would not have left had her bandmates not pressured her into joining Scientology. After that, Licorice's trail disappeared. She last visited her family in Edinburgh, 1986, but her whereabouts have been unknown since 1990. According to her sister, Licorice was recovering from surgery in Sacramento, California that year. However, music journalist Mark Ellen wrote in 2000 that the singer was last seen in 1987 hitchhiking across the Arizona desert. Not even her family has heard from her since. It is unclear whether or not Licorice's family ever reported her missing. Though her name might not be as well known now as it was in the 60s and 70s, it's worth noting that no one of such fame back then has been able to completely vanish in the way that Licorice has. When asked about her former bandmate, Rose Simpson stated, "None of us would have chosen lives of financial success, and I don't think Lick would either. So she would probably have been willing enough to collect any royalties owed to her. As far as I know, she hasn't done that. So she is either not alive or not part of any society that relies on money, so removed from mainstream life then." She also added, "I doubt if she would have chosen, as she got older like me, to entirely cut herself off from her sister and family. When I last heard, a year or two ago, she was still unknown to them. I know people claim to know her, and I have been sent a supposed photo, but I can't say I recognized her." Licorice is still missing to this day. Donald Scott Smith. Born on February 13th, 1955, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, Donald Scott Smith, better known by his middle name, was a talented musician from an early age, where he began studying guitar before moving on to bass at the age of 12. It wasn't long after that he got his big break, when, while studying at the University of Manitoba, he was approached by Paul Dean, the lead guitarist of a recently formed Canadian rock band named Loverboy. The original bass player had quit not long after they began playing gigs, and Scott jumped at the chance to live his dream. Loverboy was initially rejected by all the major record labels in the US, but on March 20th, 1980, they signed with Columbia Records of Canada, a label owned by Sony. The band's self-titled debut album was released just 5 months later and launched the group into stardom, selling over 1 million records in Canada alone. Following the success of the album, they toured with the likes of ZZ Top and Def Leppard, and in the autumn of 1981, they released their second record, Get Lucky, while supporting the band Journey. Get Lucky became the group's best-selling record in the US, and sold over 4 million copies. Loverboy subsequently received several Juno Awards in recognition of their achievements as a group. As well as being the band's bass player, Scott was also a songwriter, being credited with co-writing several of Loverboy's songs, including their 1983 hit Lucky Ones. For several years, Loverboy rode the wave of their success, but in the mid-1980s, tension rose between lead singer Mike Reno and guitarist Paul Dean. In 1987, the band released their fifth album, which performed surprisingly poorly, and in 1988, Loverboy announced their split, largely due to difficulties between Dean and Reno. Following the breakup, Scott joined the band Dangerous, along with Reno, and worked a brief stint as a late-night radio DJ. Loverboy reunited momentarily in 1991 to perform a benefit concert, and a further 2 years later, the band rejoined again to tour throughout the 1990s. Scott reportedly told journalists the band got back together, quote, "because we like to rock, and simply because promoters wanted to book us." Scott was last seen on November 30th, 2000, while the band were on break from tour. That day, he decided to take out his sailing boat, a 36-foot craft named the Sea Major. Described as an avid and experienced sailor, he aimed to sail a marina south of LA with his fiancée, Yvonne Mayett, and longtime friend Bill Ellis, who'd been a roadie for Loverboy during the 1980s. The three planned to stop in Mexico before reaching LA. Bill would later recall the events of the day while speaking with the Montreal Gazette. Quote, "We were just 2 hours out from the dock in San Francisco. 1 minute he was there, and the next he was gone. It happened very, very quickly." According to reports, the day had started okay. There was a little bit of fog, but the winds were calm. But around 4:48 that afternoon, weather conditions suddenly turned. Both Bill and Yvonne were below deck when a 25-foot wave hit the boat, knocking it to its side and tearing the steering wheel from the vessel. Bill stated, "I went down below to change into my foul weather gear so I could relieve Scott, and then the wave hit and the boat went over on its side. Within seconds, I went back up and Scott was gone. We turned back around, but couldn't find any of the debris or cushions or the man overboard pole. 20 minutes later, following a distress call from the Sea Major, a Coast Guard helicopter arrived. 2 boats reached the scene 10 minutes later. There was no sign of Scott, and the worsening weather conditions meant that the search had to be called off prematurely. The search for Scott, or his body, continued the following day, but was ended that afternoon by the Coast Guard. Bill, along with his friends and family, hired a private team to keep looking until Sunday. Unfortunately, there was no trace of the 45-year-old. He was pronounced missing and presumed dead. He left behind 2 young children, along with his fiancée. In 2007, Loverboy singer Mike Reno reflected on the news that one of his closest friends was gone. "I didn't think I could go on with the band. The last thing I felt like doing was singing songs that Scotty and I and the boys had been playing together for 22 years at that point." He said that it was both time and messages of support from fans that helped him ease back into playing music again, with fans stating that it would be a double tragedy if Loverboy never toured again. That same year, the band released a new album which included the track Stranded, a tribute to their bass player. The remains of Scott have never been located. Elenia Carisi. Elenia Carisi was born on November 29, 1970, in Rome, Italy. She was the oldest daughter of Albano Carisi, a famous Italian singer and actor who has sold over 25 million records, and Romina Power, an LA-born actress and singer, and the second child of prominent Golden Age Hollywood actors Tyrone Power and Linda Christian. Elenia's acting career began at a young age. When she was 13, she starred with her parents in a movie called Champagne in Paradiso. 6 years later, she became the letter turner on the Italian version of the show Wheel of Fortune. Despite the stardom in her blood, Elenia didn't seem to take much to acting or singing. Instead, she wanted to become a novelist. She moved to London, England, and began studying literature at King's College, where she was noted to have received the highest marks in her class. Something seemed to be stirring, though, inside Elenia. She began thinking about the idea of traveling solo. Her mother stated that she wanted to, quote, find characters for a book she was writing. Elenia decided at that point to put her studies on hold so that she could go on an adventure alone. She returned to Italy and sold her belongings so that she could fund the trip by herself, taking only her backpack and a journal. She then flew out to South America, beginning her journey in Belize, where she spent several months. On Boxing Day 1993, she decided that it was time to move on and traveled to New Orleans, Louisiana. In New Orleans, Elenia stayed at the now-defunct Le Dale, a hotel located at 749 Charles Street in the French Quarter of the city. According to the Doe Network, she was staying at the hotel with a 54-year-old street musician she had met in the city in the summer of 1993. Back then, she had been in New Orleans on holiday with her parents. While they moved on to Florida, she stayed behind to paint and write. However, she fled to Florida 2 days later, claiming that 2 men were trying to drug and kill her. Further details about this incident do not appear to be available. Elenia last had contact with her family on January 1st, 1994, when she phoned her parents. She was last seen around January 6th. Hotel staff claimed that she left around noon that day and never returned. She left all of her personal belongings behind, including her backpack and passport. The man she was staying with remained at the hotel until January 14th, when he attempted to check out and pay the bill using traveler's checks made payable to Elenia. For weeks, Elenia wasn't seen or heard from. Her parents reported her missing on January 18th. Police efforts to find her were fruitless, and her family remained with more questions than answers. Then, at the end of January, a security guard working at the Audubon Aquarium of the Americas came forward to claim that he had seen the young woman on the night of January 6th. He claimed to have found her at around 11:30 p.m. in Waldenburg Park on the west bank of the Mississippi River, where she was sitting on a pier. She described the woman as blonde, between the ages of 18 to 24, and said she was wearing a jacket and floral dress. He told her that she couldn't be in the park after hours, and she allegedly told him, quote, "It doesn't matter. I belong in the river." She then plunged into the water and swam towards the center. Before long, though, the woman began to struggle and called for help. A passing boat made huge waves, and the woman disappeared beneath the water. The Coast Guard searched 90 miles of river, but found no sign of the woman. It has never been confirmed that the woman was Alenia, and no bodies matching her description have ever been recovered. Notably, her father stated that on a previous trip to New Orleans, Alenia had gone into the Mississippi River but gotten scared and climbed back out. He added that she'd been under the effects of marijuana at the time. On January 31st, Alexander Masekela, the street musician who'd stayed with Alenia at the hotel, was arrested after a former girlfriend said he sexually assaulted her, but was released due to a lack of evidence. He has never been tied to Alenia's case. When approached by the media, he said only, "I believe she is safe." Several sources, including the Charlie Project, note that Masekela was described as being a violent man with a history of drug use. He reportedly wanted sexual favors from Alenia, who refused him and specifically asked for separate beds in the hotel room. Despite the testimony of the security guard, Alenia's parents theorized that she had been taken hostage and was being held against her will. Their beliefs were deepened by the numerous unconfirmed sightings from up and down the country. In 2008, a German magazine reported that Alenia was alive and well, living in a convent near Phoenix, Arizona. Her parents found the publication of this article distasteful, with her father calling the story shameful speculation containing not a bit of truth. Alenia's father had declared her dead in 2013, believing his daughter died the night she went missing. Her mother, meanwhile, has said she believes she is still alive. Quote, "As a mother, I know Alenia is still alive, somewhere. I'm absolutely convinced." Romina and Albano's marriage disintegrated, in large part because of Alenia's disappearance, but the two seem to be on good terms and continue to make music together. Alenia Carisi is still missing. She is described as a white woman with blonde hair and green eyes. She is between 5'7" and 5'9" and was 120 pounds at the time of her disappearance. If she is still alive, she will be 53 years old. Anyone with information about her case should contact the New Orleans Police Department at 504-658-5315. Elijah View. On February 12th, 3-year-old Elijah View was dropped off in Two Rivers, Wisconsin by his mother, 31-year-old Katrina Bauer. Living in Wisconsin Dell, Bauer drove over 150 miles to Two Rivers and left the toddler in the hands of her boyfriend, a 39-year-old man named Jesse Vang, who reportedly used extreme and abusive disciplinary methods on Elijah in an attempt to make him fear his mother. According to CNN, court documents showed that Bauer had sent the 3-year-old to Vang so he could teach her son, by example, how to be a man. The so-called disciplinary measures included cold showers and timeouts where Elijah was made to stand up for hours on end. Bauer would later tell investigators that she made clear to Vang what sorts of methods were not to be used against her son. Elijah stayed with Vang between February 12th and February 20th. On the 14th, a photo of him was taken by his mother who was visiting. It showed the young boy wearing a blindfold with bruising on his face. He was lying on a bed. A day later, another photo was taken, showing him standing in a corner dressed in nothing but a nappy, which was full, and his hands in a praying position. The Manitowoc DA would later allege that on the 16th, Elijah was left alone for an hour at Vang's residence. During the days leading up to Elijah's disappearance, several text messages were exchanged between Vang and Bauer. On February 18th, Vang wrote, "I told you to trust me. I'ma make sure he hates me being there." She replied, "Don't want him to hate you, just fear you." Vang noted that somebody had to be, quote, "the bad person," and Bauer responded, "I know, but either way he can fear you and respect you." Vang claimed that Elijah feared him, quote, "but he didn't respect me. Now I'm making him respect me. If you will forgive this narrator a moment to editorialize, this behavior is beyond disgusting. Abusing and terrorizing a child never leads to respect, nor does it, quote, toughen them up. It is the behavior of cowards. On the morning of February 20th, at around 7:30, Vang woke up to give Elijah breakfast, which consisted of cereal without milk. Half an hour later, the little boy was told to stand at the foot of Vang's bed and pray while Vang took a nap. According to Vang's testimony, this was the last time he saw Elijah alive. At 10:59 a.m., he called the Two Rivers Police Department to report the 3-year-old missing. An Amber Alert was subsequently issued to the residents of Two Rivers, and that afternoon, volunteers gathered to help search for the little boy. Outbuildings, vehicles, fields, and storm drains were thoroughly checked for any signs of Elijah. Police used drones and scent dogs to aid with the search, but no trace of the 3-year-old was found. Jesse Vang was arrested that evening, while Elijah's mother, Katrina Bauer, was arrested the following day, having changed her story about her son's whereabouts several times while speaking with police. Over the next few days, the search for Elijah continued, eventually involving the FBI, the Wisconsin Department of Criminal Investigators, and numerous county sheriff's offices. Dive teams searched waterways, and on February 26th, a local landfill was examined for clues. The FBI announced a $15,000 reward for information, while Elijah's other family members pleaded with the public for information, noting, quote, "The pain is indescribable. We cannot express our sorrow or the desperation that consumes us. To anyone with information on Elijah's whereabouts, we plead with you to please come forward." They added that his unexplained absence is, quote, "a torment no family or child should ever face." While Bauer was initially charged with party to a crime, child neglect, further charges of obstruction were added 6 days after Elijah disappeared. On March 7th, she appeared in court to appeal against her $15,000 bond. Her own mother wrote a letter to the court, noting her daughter's pattern of behavior, poor judgment, and lack of responsibility. She wrote, quote, "Her story always depends on her audience. At this time, rather than aligning in locating her son, she feels the need to reiterate what a good guy Jesse is and fully defending him and his actions. By aligning with him, she could potentially have access to his extended family and ability to flee the area." She added, "I don't feel it's worth the risk to lower her bond, especially as Elijah has not been found and many questions remain unanswered." Bauer's appeal was ultimately rejected, and her child neglect charge was upped to chronic child neglect. A further child neglect charge was laid against her concerning a 6-year-old girl, believed to be her daughter, whom she left alone in the car in cold temperatures on February 14th, when she visited Vang and Elijah. As for Vang, he already had a criminal history, including previous convictions for child abuse. He told investigators about some of his other so-called disciplinary tactics, which included that Elijah was not allowed to play with toys, as he was staying with Vang as, quote, punishment. Vang also revealed that Elijah was given a cold shower on February 17th after he had filled his nappy. Both Vang and Bauer entered not guilty pleas in relation to the child neglect charges they were facing. On March 14th, investigators revealed photographs of a beige 1997 Nissan Altima. They stated that police were in possession of the vehicle, but that they needed help tracing its movements the day before Elijah went missing. They requested that anyone with CCTV on their property take a look back at the footage to see if the Nissan Altima appeared in the hours between 2 p.m. and 9 p.m. 2 weeks later, on March 18th, it was announced that Elijah's blanket, described as being made of red and white plaid, was discovered on Goodwin Road, east of County Road B, in Manitowoc County. Officials noted that the blanket had been found sooner, but had only recently been confirmed as belonging to the 3-year-old. It was found 3.7 miles from the 3900 block of Mishicut Road, where Elijah had disappeared. Two Rivers Police Chief Ben Minot told WLUK that investigators had reviewed more than 10,000 video files, conducted dozens of interviews, and followed hundreds of leads in an attempt to locate 3-year-old Elijah. Quote, "We literally went into every home, talked to everybody that lived in each home. We checked every room, every cabinet, everything in those homes." But Elijah is still missing. The 3-year-old was last seen in Two Rivers, Wisconsin, on February 20th, 2024. He is described as a half-white and half-Hmong male with sandy brown hair and brown eyes. He is 3 feet tall and weighs around 45 pounds. At the time of his disappearance, he was wearing grey jogging bottoms, a long-sleeved, dark-coloured top, and red and green dinosaur slip-on shoes. He has a birthmark on his left knee. If you have any information about Elijah's whereabouts, you can contact the Two Rivers Police Department at 844-267-6648. Kasha Smith. 35-year-old Kasha Smith was reported missing on January 5th after her concerned family members contacted the police. She was last heard from 2 months earlier on November 4th, 2023, and her loved ones found it unusual that she had not spoken to anyone in months. Kasha was last seen at her home in Calder Grove, an area of Edinburgh, Scotland, on October 10th, 2023, at the home she shared with her partner. After she was reported missing, investigators looked into a potential sighting of the mother of 3 in the Slateford area of the city, but were unable to confirm if the woman seen was Kasha. Following her disappearance, police searched her Calder Grove property, along with a section of the Union Canal, just 100 yards from her home. Officers also combed through a nearby wooded area, along with metal containers not far from the residence. Despite using scent dogs and carrying out multiple searches of these areas, nothing of note was found. Uniformed police began distributing missing posters to locals and in stores to encourage potential witnesses to come forward. Few other details are available on the investigation, but several sources reportedly told the media that the police were concerned that something sinister had befallen Kasha. One of Kasha's children, Callie, recently turned 18 and said in a statement, "I recently had my 18th birthday and didn't hear anything from my mum. She would never miss my birthday, my sister's birthdays, or Christmas. We miss her so much. We want nothing more than for my mum to walk through the door and be able to give her a massive hug. It feels like I'm living the worst dream I could ever imagine. I can't express what it would mean to have my mum home. Even the smallest piece of information might be all we need to find her." Kasha's mother, Nicola Neal, echoed similar statements, describing how the family were, quote, "sick with worry," and urging anyone with potential information to come forward. Quote, "Kasha is my friend as well as my daughter, and we are living a nightmare. It is hard for us to find the words to explain the not knowing where she is and if anything has happened to her. These past few weeks have been horrendous and painful for us all." Police, for their part, have stated that they are keeping an open mind about the disappearance, and added that they are currently combing through Kasha's bank records as part of their investigation. So far, no suspects have been named, and no persons of interest have arisen. They also stated that they are keen to speak with friends who may have information about her whereabouts before she was last seen on October 10th, 2023. In late March, cards, balloons, and flowers were attached to a fence near Kasha's home to mark her 36th birthday. Kasha is described as a white woman with long blonde hair and blue eyes. She is 5 foot tall and of a slim build, and has several tattoos, one of which is the word "forever" on her right wrist. She worked at Edinburgh College before she went missing, and is known to frequent the areas of Georgie, Broomhouse, and Wester Hales in the city. If you have any information about Kasha's disappearance and reside in Scotland, you can contact Police Scotland on 101. If you are outside of Scotland but still in the UK, you can contact them at 0141 308 1070. Sebastian Rogers. 15-year-old Sebastian Rogers was reported missing from Hendersonville, Tennessee on the morning of February 26th, when his mother went to wake him up for school, only to find his bed empty. Katie Proudfoot, Sebastian's mother, said on the night of the 25th, Sebastian took out the trash at the end of the driveway. At around 9 p.m., he was told to go to bed. Katie recalled, quote, "He was doing something in his room, because about an hour later, I heard some noise, and I was like, I don't care what you're doing in there, but go to sleep." She described her son as having high-functioning autism and being very smart and not mischievous by any means. At 6 a.m. the following morning, she discovered that he was missing. She first called her husband, Sebastian's stepfather, Chris, and stated, "I can't find him." Chris replied, "What do you mean you can't find him?" Katie recalled answering, "He's not in the house." She searched the entire property from top to bottom, but there was no sign of the 15-year-old. Sebastian has no history of running away from home, and when asked if he had simply wandered off, Katie replied, "I don't know why he walked out that door." After reporting his disappearance to the police, an Amber Alert was issued to locals to help try and track him down. Over the next few months, both state and local police, along with 1,500 volunteers, helped to search for the missing teenager. They used helicopters, drones, and the K-9 unit, while officers on foot combed through fields, abandoned buildings, and any place that a teenager might hide. Authorities even, at one point, played his favorite song, Eye of the Tiger, while they searched for him, hoping it would draw him out. But still there was no sign of the missing boy. Soon, investigators were meticulously raking through the landfill where the trash from Sebastian's home had ended up. Authorities described this search as a precautionary measure to eliminate possible options and questions. On March 23rd, the volunteer organization, the United Cajun Navy, revealed that a team was being sent to help in the search for Sebastian after being approached by Seth Rogers, Sebastian's biological father. On April 1st, however, the Independent reported that the group received death threats over its involvement in the case. Although the team stopped searches for Sebastian, it continued to work on the case behind the scenes. A spokesperson for the group stated, "We've never had the situation occur before," referring to the received death threats. The spokesperson added, "No volunteers' information is ever given out or anything like that, but these folks can certainly arrive on scene and cause a problem and a ruckus." On March 25th, Sebastian's mother admitted her fear that her son had been taken by someone, stating, quote, "I feel like if he had been close to the house or had walked off, that we would have found him by now, with as many people as have been searching. Notably, Sebastian had left his family's home without a pair of shoes." 10 weeks after the disappearance, reports came in that a pair of trousers were located by Goodlettsville police and were initially thought to belong to Sebastian. However, upon examination, they were ruled out as belonging to the 15-year-old. Details about the trousers, including a description or where they were found, are unclear. 2 months later, in May, a photo emerged online which showed a boy resembling Sebastian at an underpass in North Carolina. His biological father, Seth, told the media that he was convinced the boy in the photograph was his son and called for the FBI to become involved in the investigation. The police, however, disagreed, stating that the boy shown was not Sebastian. They had reached this conclusion after working with the North Carolina authorities to track the boy down. Seth Rogers has since hired a private investigator. 15-year-old Sebastian Rogers was last seen on the night of February 25th, 2024, at his home in Hendersonville, Tennessee. He is described as a white male with brown hair and brown eyes. He is 5'5" and weighs around 120 pounds. When he was last seen, he was wearing a black sweatshirt, black jogging bottoms, and glasses. He is described as having high-functioning autism. Anyone with information about his case can contact the Sumner County Sheriff's Office at 615-442-1865. You can also email Detective Carter at bcarter@sumnersheriff.com. In 1950, Ruth King met and fell in love with Russell Alter, a twice-divorced railroad fireman with a solid reputation. Deputy Sheriff Clyde Murray later described him as having a #1 record with me and called him one of the city's top men. On Christmas Eve that year, the couple tied the knot, and in February of 1951, they moved from Russell's parents' property to their newly purchased house at 350 North Sylvan Avenue in the neighborhood of Hilltop. 2 months later, on April 8th, Ruth, now 32, gave birth to the couple's first child, a son they named Clarence Frederick. For a little over 2 weeks, the couple enjoyed time as a family. They were, by all accounts, enamored with their newborn, but their happiness was shattered on April 25th when Russell returned home one evening to find Ruth dead. On the morning of April 25th, at around 5:30, Russell kissed his new bride goodbye and left the house for a day of work. At the time, the 39-year-old had 2 jobs. His full-time employment was with the Pennsylvania Railroad, but he also had a part-time gig with the special deputies as a motorcycle escort for funerals. Ruth was known to still be alive at 8:35 a.m. when Clyde Murray, reported in newspapers as being in charge of the special deputies, called the couple's home and asked to speak with Russell. Ruth explained that at 5 o'clock that morning, her husband had been called in for a shift with the Pennsylvania Railroad and wouldn't be home until 3 or 3:30 that afternoon. Clyde had called in regards to a funeral taking place later in the day, but he and Ruth said their goodbyes when he realized Russell wasn't available. Ruth's movements after this time are unknown. Russell, meanwhile, finished work at around 3 p.m. and headed over to see his mother, Stella Drugan, and his stepfather, H. The trio caught up with one another and shared a meal before the 39-year-old invited his parents back to his new home. For some time, H. Drugan had been ill, so he hadn't been inside the couple's new house yet, nor had he met their new baby. Russell added that he planned to go to the shops, but said that he needed to speak with his wife first to see what she needed, so the three headed over to North Sylvan Avenue. Back at the couple's property at around 6 p.m., Russell noticed that the door was unlocked. This was unusual, and he'd made sure to lock it when he left that morning, but it wasn't something which immediately alarmed him. He ushered his parents inside and followed afterwards. It was his mother, Stella, who discovered the body in the doorway where the kitchen met the living room. The scene was, by all accounts, a bloodbath. Blood was spattered across the stove, the fridge, the bins, the back door, the kitchen table, the walls, and even on the ceiling. Ruth's end had been a horrifically violent one. She was still wearing her slip dress and dressing gown. Officers who responded to the scene later recalled Stella saying, "Oh my God, she's had a hemorrhage." Ruth had been brutally beaten, almost beyond recognition. Likely, investigators suspected, with a loafer-style shoe which belonged to her husband. He had left the pair just inside the living room doorway. The shoe was located by officers, who noticed that an attempt had been made to clean it, and the heel of it was missing and never located. Puncture wounds found on Ruth's body had possibly been made by the nails protruding from the sole of the shoe, where the heel had come off, and the 32-year-old had also suffered a blow across her chest, shoulder to shoulder, about 4 inches wide. Additionally, there were fingernail marks on her neck, suggesting she had been strangled, though her cause of death was listed as a broken neck. A bloody slip located at the scene was believed to have been what was used to try and clean the shoe. Other evidence recovered from the home included a bloodied cloth rag from beneath Ruth's body and numerous bloodied paper towels from near the body and inside the bathroom. Investigators theorized that the struggle that had taken place had started in the bedroom, noting that there was blood between the pillows and down the side of the bed. A broken lamp was also observed in the room. Fingerprints were collected from the home, although it doesn't appear that these prints were of any use, as they did not lead anywhere in the investigation. Several items were noted to be missing from the home, including $1 which had been lying on a dresser, a Ronson lighter, and a watch worth $185. Thankfully, the couple's baby, Clarence, was discovered safe inside his crib in one of the bedrooms. though he had likely been left unattended for most of the day. Russell felt that he and his parents were in too much of a state of shock to look after the child, so he asked his second ex-wife, Betty Lehman, to temporarily care for Clarence. She and her new husband were good friends with Ruth and Russell, and she was more than happy to take the baby on in their time of tragedy. Very early on in the investigation, officers with Franklin County Sheriff's Office began theorizing. Initially, they suspected that Ruth's murder was some sort of revenge killing. Russell, however, was referred to as a top man who didn't have any enemies. Ruth, meanwhile, was originally from the city of Zanesville, and her father was deceased. She spent 5 years before she met her husband working at the Broad Hague restaurant as a waitress, where couples knew her as quiet and pleasant, noting that she never discussed her personal life. At one point, investigators noted that a former colleague of Russell's had been questioned in connection with the case, but he was released without charge. There was some speculation by law enforcement that the killer had used the nearby train tracks to come and go from the scene, but this idea was eventually dismissed. Authorities then began searching for any strangers seen loitering in the neighborhood around the time of the murder, although they could not be sure when that was. The coroner originally believed the killing to be between 12 and 15 hours before she was found, but that would change when it was discovered she was last seen alive at 5:30 a.m. and was last heard on the phone between 8:35 and 8:45. Investigators suspected she was possibly killed around noon. Shortly after the murder, a sheriff's deputy revealed, "We have a theory about the mysterious stranger, but we're not disclosing it." Upon speaking with neighbors, investigators discovered that 2 witnesses had seen an unknown man knock on their doors and leave before they were able to answer. The first sighting was around 7:45 a.m., while the other was about an hour later, just before 9. One of the witnesses stated that the individual approached the Alters home afterwards and described the man as being between 5'10" and 6 foot tall, with a brown leather briefcase and a blue-gray suit. However, one neighbor, a man who was out working in his garden between 8 and 12 p.m., noted that he didn't see anyone strange and unrecognizable in the area during this time. Of course, Russell was questioned shortly after Ruth's body was found. He was quizzed by authorities for 9 hours, not including breaks, and was subject to a polygraph test, which he passed. The 39-year-old arrived at work at 6:40 a.m. alongside another colleague, an engineer. The two worked their shift together between 7 a.m. and 3 p.m. Russell was described as having an excellent work record, and between his alibi and his response to the polygraph test, he was ruled out as a suspect. Notably, a lot more stock was put into polygraph tests back in 1951 than it is today, where more often than not, the results of these so-called lie detectors are not admissible in court. In total, 6 people were questioned and released on the day of Ruth's murder, including Betty Lehman, Russell's ex-wife. In the following days, they announced that the stranger they were looking for, who had been seen by several eyewitnesses on the morning of April 25th, was likely a salesman. They also noted that they were searching for a late model blue-colored Chevrolet, which had been parked across the road from the Alter residence that day. Several previously unknown clues were also discussed by authorities during this time. Firstly, it came to light that strands of brown and grey hair, which had been clutched in Ruth's hand at the time of her death, had been lost when the coroner failed to deem them as important, and an attendant assisting with the post-mortem washed them away. Secondly, though, was that 2 buttons, described as being pearl-covered, were found next to Ruth's body at the scene. They are likely to have come from a woman's coat or a men's sports jacket, with the coroner stating that they were apparently from a woman's clothing. Notably, there were no buttons on the garments Ruth was wearing when she was killed. The reveal of the buttons found at the scene led to some speculation that a woman was responsible for the death, or at least involved in some way. Over the next few weeks, investigators followed several leads. They looked into the backgrounds of 2 brothers who had left bloody clothing in their sister's home. The brothers denied any knowledge of the case and the bloody clothing, which was never found. They also checked out a dress with missing buttons, which had been given to a dry cleaner. Around this time, there were rumors that Ruth had previously testified against a Columbus-based narcotics ring, and her mother-in-law, Stella, was subject to an eerie, threatening phone call where a woman said, quote, "Mrs. Alter, ain't you dead yet? You too will be murdered soon." Though Stella hung up immediately, the person called back. They were never identified. Stella stated she sounded like she was either drunk or trying to disguise her voice. A former girlfriend of Russell's, who had reportedly taken a strong dislike to Ruth and threatened her, was separately investigated, followed by a red-haired youth who had assaulted a local 57-year-old. But despite all the possible leads and information, the police were unable to find anything solid. In early May, those close to Ruth and Russell were re-interrogated, along with other potential persons of interest, including a 40-year-old waitress who was an ex-girlfriend of Russell. She would later be cleared of involvement after passing a polygraph test. Still, no motive for Ruth's murder surfaced. Authorities then decided to offer a $500 reward for anyone with information leading to an arrest and conviction of Ruth's killer, but the large sum of cash went unclaimed. Several weeks later, a 23-year-old salesman was questioned in connection with the case, with witnesses identifying his car as the one seen parked outside of the Alter home on the morning of the murder. With the identification of the car, investigators told reporters, "We are optimistic there will be evidential proof against this man as the investigation develops during the day." They added that the young man was a former friend of Ruth's and had been questioned twice previously. He came back to the attention of law enforcement when they re-examined his statements and noticed some discrepancies. They claimed he was still changing his story during interviews. Police also noted that they believed the killer was someone known to Ruth because she appeared to have let that person into her home. Authorities revealed there was some circumstantial evidence against the 23-year-old, who was not immediately identified. The evidence included a lack of an alibi, bloodstains discovered on both his brake pedal and the cuffs of the trousers of a blue-grey suit he owned, with both stains confirmed as being human blood, and a business card with his name on it, which was discovered inside the Alter home. The salesman claimed that the blood came from a slaughterhouse he had visited as part of his work and denied being involved in the murder. He failed a polygraph test shortly afterwards. Then, on May 19th, the salesman's identity was revealed. 23-year-old George Phillips was the son of the owner of the Broad Hague restaurant where Ruth had spent 5 years working before her marriage to Russell. Authorities announced, quote, "Results of the lie detector test, plus evidence, warrant filing an affidavit." George was subsequently charged with first-degree murder. George Phillips was in part raised by his grandmother, who had moved to America from Greece when her children, including George's mother, were young. A terrifying accident when he was just 2 years old, which involved him running out into the road after his ball and being struck by a car, saw part of his right arm be amputated. Although this made things difficult for him growing up, George often took advantage of the way his peers would underestimate him. Our patron, Jenny, reached out to one of his childhood friends, who told her he would often play up his handicap to older children at the park and challenge them to games of tennis, where, if he won, they would hand over their money. The older children, surprised by his boldness, would agree to the bet and be easily beaten by George, who walked away with their cash in his pocket. George was described by those who knew him as likable and pleasant. He began attending university after graduating from school, but ultimately dropped out and became employed as a salesman. A local grocery store owner recalled how the last time he saw the 23-year-old, shortly before his arrest, he had been discussing his favorite soup recipes. According to newspapers at the time, George had known Ruth through her work at his father's restaurant for 4 years, and the two had reportedly had a run-in at some point during this time, with investigators stating that, back then, Ruth had slapped the young man for an inappropriate remark he had made to her. George then hit Ruth back, with police quoting him as saying, "I hit her harder than I intended to." Authorities suggested that a similar set of events had led to the mother of one's death on April 25th. They theorized that George had come to the house to see the newborn baby and secure a time to discuss taking out an insurance policy for him. Then, at some point during the visit, the 23-year-old hit Ruth, perhaps harder than he meant to, and she'd struck her head on the bed and lost consciousness. When she came to, she ordered George out and followed him into the living room, where she picked up one of her husband's shoes and hit the young man with it. George then lost his temper and retaliated by grabbing the footwear and beating Ruth with it until she fell to the ground. Detective Lieutenant Lester Bauman described George as an unfortunate youth with a violent temper. Upon searching George's home again, which he shared with his grandmother, investigators discovered a pair of shoes that they hadn't previously been able to locate. The shoes had blood on the soles, but it was obvious that an attempt had been made to clean them. Similarly, a briefcase was found that also had traces of blood on it. Authorities observed that the 23-year-old drove a blue 1937 Pontiac. During the initial court hearing, 3 colleagues testified that George was in a work meeting and was later at a restaurant on the morning of the murder. His defense also produced a witness who countered what 2 of the prosecution's witnesses were saying, that an unidentified man matching George's description had come to their doors earlier that day. The defense's witness was that same man we mentioned earlier, who was out working in his garden all morning and saw nobody odd or unfamiliar come or go. George's defense lawyer, Paul Herbert, also questioned Russell Alter during this time, making sure to interrogate him over the state of his marriage and his personal life, even querying the paternity of the couple's son, Clarence. George Phillips was ultimately released on a $50,000 bond due to an obscure Ohio law. 21 of his friends and relatives pledged the $50,000 in cash or property, allowing him to leave jail until his formal trial started. Upon his release, George stated, "It is with the sincerest appreciation and deepest humility that I take this opportunity to express my thanks to my many friends for their confidence in me." In August, the Franklin County grand jury indicted George on second-degree murder after hearing testimony from 33 witnesses. If found guilty, he would be sentenced to life behind bars, but could be considered for parole after 10 years. The following month, Ruth's body was exhumed. She had been laid to rest in Rose Hill Cemetery, south of Zanesville, in a plot near her father's. The Franklin County prosecutor, Ralph Bartlett, told reporters no comment when news broke of this development. Newspaper accounts observed that Ruth's face and neck were studied, and photographs were taken of her closed casket. Finally, on October 23rd, George's trial began. Paul Herbert, his lawyer, filed a notice of alibi just days earlier, despite the fact that the prosecution had still not narrowed down Ruth's time of death, stating that it was unknown to the state of Ohio when Herbert pushed for a detailed answer to help him with his client's alibi. During the trial, further circumstantial evidence came to light, including witness testimony that a bloody shirt had been found among George's laundry. The defense, meanwhile, noted that fingernail marks had been found on both sides of Ruth's neck and pointed out that George only had his left hand. It was also at this time that several witnesses for the prosecution began receiving threats via telephone. One woman was told, quote, "Well, you better watch out." Another answered the phone to hear, quote, "You and your husband are on the spot. He had better keep his mouth shut." The witness said the voice was in broken English. 2 other witnesses received threats, but the source of the harassment was never found. Paul Herbert is known to have dismissed the concerns of the prosecution in this matter, stating his belief that the publicity-hungry witnesses had made up the stories. Ruth's case and the trial were highly publicized and eventually gave way to a media circus. George's defense lawyer and the Franklin County prosecutor were known enemies with a lengthy history, and eventually the trial became more of a mudslinging match involving the egos of 2 feuding men, rather than a true attempt to find justice for a horrific tragedy. After weeks of testimony, the jury was not convinced. On November 9th, George Phillips was acquitted of all charges. According to our patron Jenny, following this, George became something of a social pariah. He lost his job and his reputation remained in tatters. He was never able to go back to the life he once lived, and wound up moving to Los Angeles, California, to start over where nobody knew his name. Russell Alter, the husband Ruth left behind, didn't fare much better. He lost both of his jobs, thanks in no small part to the authorities considering him a suspect early on, and him undergoing arrests and questioning several times throughout the investigation. A 1953 article from the Columbus Evening Dispatch observes that Russell filed a civil lawsuit against George Phillips, charging that the 25-year-old wrongfully, unlawfully, maliciously, and intentionally killed his wife, and seeking $75,000, $900,000 today, in damages for himself and his son. Russell also sued the Franklin County Sheriff, Ralph Paul, for $25,000, claiming he was falsely arrested and noting that he spent 4 days in prison in April 1951, just days after he found his wife murdered. He added that the arrest was done without a warrant and without reasonable or probable cause, noting that it was a humiliating experience and that his reputation never bounced back. Sheriff Paul declined to comment for the article. 5 months after reports emerged about Russell's lawsuits, the Columbus Evening Dispatch announced that the 42-year-old was set to remarry. His fourth wife, Alice Adkins, was a divorced mother of 4 and was acquainted with the couple before Ruth's murder. She was one of the people questioned by police following the discovery of the body. Alice remained married to Russell until he died in 1964. He was 53 years old. Russell and Ruth's son, Clarence Frederick, or Fred as he prefers to be known, recalled Alice as a kind woman who raised him as her own and gave him a happy childhood, all things considered. Meanwhile, his father made sure to keep in regular contact with Ruth's side of the family, and they would attend King family reunions every summer. Our patron Jenny reached out to Fred on Facebook, where she was able to learn a little about his life. It was here that Fred revealed that one day, some years ago, while at work, he received a long-distance call from an older man. The man asked Fred how he was getting on, if he was happy, and if he had led a good life. The call, Fred noted, was brief but pleasant and polite. He didn't get the caller's name. It wasn't until afterwards, when he hung up, that he wondered if the older man was George Phillips, who would have been in his 70s at that point, and was still residing in LA. Nobody else was ever charged in the case of Ruth's murder after George was acquitted. Her case remains unsolved 70 years later. Ruby Griffiths was born in Utah in 1982 and was one of 4 sisters. She met Kevin Franke, an engineering professor at Brigham Young University, shortly after entering adulthood, and the pair quickly tied the knot and gave birth to their first child, Shari, born in 2003. 5 more children followed afterwards, with the youngest being born in 2013. The family were devout members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with Ruby later stating that her social media presence allowed her to share her beliefs in a way that they normally wouldn't. In 2015, Ruby began documenting the lives of herself, her husband, and their children on the YouTube channel 8 Passengers. Over the years, the family's regular vlogs garnered them more than 2 million subscribers and around 1 billion views. On the surface, the Frankes seemed like another ordinary American family, and the initial criticisms were mostly about the children's lack of privacy. They often filmed their children's first shaves, and even recorded a shopping trip where one of their daughters was looking to buy a bra. Critics found this content to be exploitative and unnecessary, especially when teamed with such clickbait titles and thumbnails. Many suggested that this type of content would draw in individuals with more nefarious intentions. Over the next few weeks, fresh vlogs revealed that several of the Franke children did not have any friends. 2 of the older children also noted that they did not have access to their mobile phones in over a year. Before long, everyday viewers grew concerned about Ruby's overly harsh disciplinary methods, and their worries grew so loud that 8 Passengers became exposed to a much wider range of internet commenters. Massive commentary channels, ranging from Jay Aubrey to Swoop to H3H3, began covering the now viral clips of Ruby discussing her children's lack of food and proper beds, both of which she saw as fitting punishments for petty issues the children had apparently caused. Notably, Ruby was no stranger to cease and desist letters, as she sent out multiple to commentary channels at this time, including to YouTubers Ready to Glare and Sloan. One of the most notable instances of Ruby's so-called punishments was when her 6-year-old daughter turned up to school with no lunch. When she was contacted by the girl's teacher and asked to drop something off, Ruby refused. She claimed that it was the 6-year-old's responsibility to pack her own lunch in the morning, and said that going hungry throughout the day would be a punishment, which would help her daughter remember that she needed to make lunch for herself. Ruby added that she asked that her daughter not be given anything to eat by the school or her peers. In various other clips, Ruby can be seen telling 2 of her children that if they don't behave, they will not be allowed to eat dinner, threatening to behead one child's plush toy, and even, at one point, claiming that Santa wouldn't be visiting the 2 children that year because they were not responding to other forms of punishment. According to AP News, some of those other forms of punishment included being kept home from school and being forced to clean the floorboards. Ruby reportedly stated, quote, "It's because they're so numb, and the more numb your child is, the bigger the outcome they need to wake them up." Another controversial disciplinary measure carried out by Kevin and Ruby was when they sent their eldest son, who was 14 at the time, to a desert camp named the Anasazi Foundation Wilderness Program. The foundation's website states that parents who find it difficult to communicate with their children may find benefits in sending them to this wilderness camp, noting, quote, "We offer an opportunity to significantly improve their relationship through a walking in the wilderness." The foundation, a non-profit organization headquartered in Arizona, was founded in 1988 and reportedly aims to give troubled teens a chance to heal at the hands of nature. It offers not only the wilderness camp, but also several other resources for parents, including parent seminars. The wilderness program saw the Franks' eldest son be sent away from home for 10 weeks while living in the Arizona desert. According to Kevin, the idea with wilderness therapy is if you can survive with these peers in the wilderness with nothing more than the clothes on your back and a couple of field supplies, then there's nothing in this world you can't tackle. Ruby added that out in the desert, there were real threats, including snakes, bears, and cougars, stating, "I think close encounters would be good for him." Notably, the parents never revealed what their son had done that was so extreme they had resorted to sending him to a wilderness camp for difficult youths for over 2 months, away from everything and everyone he knew. The Franks' eldest son, though, wasn't out of the woods yet. In a later video, when he was 15, it was revealed that he had lost access to his bedroom and been forced to sleep on a beanbag in the living room for 7 months after he played several pranks on his younger brother, including telling him they were going to Disneyland in the early hours of the morning, causing the younger sibling to pack a suitcase and head out to the car, and subsequently burst into tears when it was revealed the holiday wasn't happening. On a separate occasion, he pointed a BB gun at this same sibling's face. This string of out-of-proportion, cruel, and unnecessary punishments, including ritualized starvation, led to several exposés being created by the commentary community. But these critical videos are not without justification. Experts have noted that such severe discipline often does far more harm than good. Psychologist Marian Barker spoke with Business Insider about the issues surrounding the harsh punishment of children, stating, quote, "It is simply concerned with getting the child to conform to a set of predetermined, often poorly communicated, and ever-changing set of goalposts, so the child is almost doomed to fail. Children make choices with their behavior based on their emotions, and if you don't seek to understand and discuss these emotions, the child ends up storing up a host of resentment and anger at the very least. Worse," she added, "children can develop issues with self-worth and abandonment. Taking a child's bed is considered one of the worst forms of punishment a parent can dole out, as everyone seeks safety in their environment, and taking away the bed, quote, strips this out entirely, and actually leaves the child in trauma. Likely due to the scandal in 2021, the 8 Passengers channel began to decline in popularity, and uploads became less frequent. Kevin told the media that the backlash the family had received over their punishment tactics had also led them to losing brand deals and sponsorships. Eventually, the channel was deleted altogether, and in its place, in June 2022, Connections was established. This new channel was designed to give and share family and parenting advice. Several years earlier, in 2019, Ruby had met Jodi Hildebrandt after she counseled one of the Frank children. Following this, Ruby hired Hildebrandt as her personal mentor. She later stated that Hildebrandt's teachings had led her to view a warped version of the world, claiming, "I was led to believe this world was an evil place, filled with cops who control, hospitals that injure, government agencies that brainwash, church leaders who lie and lust, husbands who refuse to protect, and children who need abuse." Jodi Hildebrandt was born in June 1969 and studied English literature at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, before achieving a master's degree in educational psychology from the University of Utah. After university, Hildebrandt worked as the program director for a drug rehabilitation facility in Utah and became a licensed counselor in 2005. 2 years later, she established Connections, which was described then as a relationship and business counseling company. However, Hildebrandt has had a less than stellar track record during her career. In 2012, she was put on probation for 18 months after disclosing sensitive, confidential information about a former client to the LDS Church and Brigham Young University several years earlier. She claimed that the patient had serious issues, but never formally diagnosed him, and reportedly didn't even spend enough time with the patient to figure out what was going on. Furthermore, in 2010, a teen living with Hildebrandt, described as her niece, reported her to the police after being forced to sleep outside in a sleeping bag and having duct tape placed over her mouth. The teen also described being made to wear the same clothes for weeks on end, and investigators discovered that the girl was not enrolled in school. The teenager told officers, "Jodi is some kind of therapist and thinks she has all the answers, but Jodi insults me all the time in front of others and acts like I am evil by not letting me talk to kids or others." Neighbors recalled that in 2020, the Franke family first moved to Springville. Initially, they interacted with their local church and the children befriended others their own age. But as the years passed, the children were eventually removed from school. Around the same time as Connections came into play, Ruby and Kevin separated, with Kevin moving out of the family home in August 2022. The children were frequently left home alone from this point on, and eventually, the blinds were left permanently closed and paper was placed over the windows. Both neighbors and the oldest Franke daughter, who was now at university, repeatedly tried to involve the police, but their requests that the children be checked on often led nowhere, as the children never answered the door. The audience Hildebrandt and Ruby had on Connections was not nearly as large and loyal as it had been on the 8 Passengers channel. Ruby also created a new Instagram account as part of her work with Connections, called Moms of Truth, which, similarly to Connections, offered parenting advice. On the Instagram account, Ruby stated that followers should avoid what she referred to as coping strategies. These coping strategies included social media, exercise, and socializing. Unsurprisingly, many people, including other parents, found the strategies that Connections taught to be extreme and harsh, with some critics likening the program to a cult. NBC News reported that several former clients said Hildebrandt's techniques were based in the LDS faith, and that she used an extreme approach that included shaming her clients. Connections branded itself as a support group designed for mothers, intended to help treat those lost in the darkness of a distortion. Together, Ruby and Hildebrandt created video content that taught things, including parents shouldn't love their children unconditionally, or that children don't deserve privacy. The pair were also accused of being homophobic, transphobic, ableist, and racist in this content. Everything in Ruby's life turned upside down when she and Hildebrandt were arrested in Urbans, Utah on August 30th, 2023, on suspicion of child abuse. Shortly before their arrest, Ruby's youngest son, now 12, climbed out of a window in the home he and his siblings shared with Hildebrandt and ran to a neighbor's house. He asked for food and water, and the neighbor was alarmed to discover duct tape on the boy's ankles and wrists. They promptly alerted the police. Arrest records later stated that he was taken to the hospital and treated for deep lacerations from being tied up with rope, as well as malnourishment. His 9-year-old sister, Ruby's youngest daughter, was also rescued from the scene and found to be malnourished. The 2 remaining children in the house were taken into custody of Child Protection Services. Ruby's youngest son told police that Hildebrandt would put cayenne pepper and honey on their wounds, which were caused by being tied with a rope. Inside the home, investigators discovered sellotape, saran wrap, lots of paperwork, 2 super absorbent dressings, 2 Coban bandages, 3 sets of brown and white rope, 2 pairs of handcuffs, and 3 carabiners. Further information documented in the arrest record showed that Ruby had filmed a video in Hildebrandt's house just days earlier, meaning she was very aware of the abuse her children were suffering. She was denied bail following her arrest, given the state of her children and the fact that investigators still needed to speak with them. Both Ruby and Hildebrandt were subsequently charged with 6 felony counts of aggravated child abuse. During a shelter hearing about Ruby's 4 youngest children, her 2 oldest children had not been living at home at the time of the abuse, she made the bizarre allegation that one of the children had been sexually abusing a younger sibling and had allegedly confessed to sexually abusing others. In mid-December, Ruby's lawyers claimed she was a devoted mother as they looked to secure a plea deal. They claimed that Hildebrandt had taken advantage of the mother of 6, noting, quote, "Over an extended period, Hildebrandt systematically isolated Ruby Franke from her extended family, older children, and her husband, Kevin Franke. This prolonged isolation resulted in Ms. Franke being subjected to a distorted sense of morality, shaped by Hildebrandt's influence." A statement filed with the court to support her guilty pleas revealed that Ruby had abused her children from May 22, 2023, up until her arrest. She claimed that the punishments were a form of repentance and described her actions as acts of love. She also admitted that her actions involved physical torture. She sent her 12-year-old son to carry out demanding manual labor without shoes or water, leaving him with damaging sunburn. Furthermore, the boy was given little food and was often given plain meals, while everyone else got different, more flavorful dishes compared to him. Ruby also admitted to kicking the young boy while wearing boots, holding his head underwater, and hog-tying him. He was kept isolated with no entertainment. Ruby's youngest daughter didn't fare better. She was also forced to work outside, run on dirt roads without shoes for lengthy periods of time, and was starved and not given water. Both children were declined beds and had their heads shaved as punishment. In her diaries, Ruby referred to the children as spawns of Satan, and of her son stated, quote, "I will not feed a demon." She also called him a compulsive liar with a cold, dead heart. As for her youngest daughter, she wrote that she was manipulative and recounted the time she had had her stand in the rain for hours, cut off her hair, and once doused her in dog wash water after she complained about being hungry. Prosecutors later noted in a statement, "The women appeared to fully believe that the abuse they inflicted was necessary to teach the children how to properly repent for imagined sins and to cast the evil spirits out of their bodies." Both Ruby and Hildebrandt were deemed to be motivated by religious extremism. Ruby's husband, Kevin, reported that he had not seen his children for around 13 months since he and his wife had separated, and that he had no idea about the abuse that was happening. He added that Hildebrandt played a role in the couple's marriage disintegrating, claiming that she manipulated him and destroyed his family, as the relationship between Kevin and Ruby grew strained after she began working on connections. Ruby reportedly told her husband before he left that though their marriage needed work, it would be better if he moved out and ceased contact with his 4 youngest children. Notably, following her mother's arrest, the oldest Franke child, Sherry, who was 20 at the time and studying at university, posted a picture on her Instagram stories of police officers at Hildebrandt's house, simply captioned, "Finally." Shari had said in an April 2023 podcast that she had cut ties with her family a year earlier after she discovered that her mother was working on connections with Hildebrandt. In another Instagram post, she wrote, "Me and my family are so glad justice is being served. We've been trying to tell the police and CPS for years about this, and so glad they finally decided to step up. Kids are safe, but there's a long road ahead." Ruby's 3 sisters, who all have YouTube channels themselves, released a statement which claimed that they had been keeping quiet about Ruby for several years for the sake of her children, noting, quote, "Behind the public scene, we have done everything we could to try and make sure the kids were safe. Ruby was arrested, which needed to happen. Jody was arrested, which needed to happen. The kids are now safe, which is the #1 priority." Following Ruby's arrest, Kevin began seeking custody of his children and filed for divorce. He also attempted to get his eldest daughter, Shari, arrested for stealing electronics and passports 2 days after the arrests, stating that she was not lawfully allowed in their home. Shari claimed she was not aware that she was not allowed into her parents' home, and Kevin allegedly threatened to sue the police department because they declined to press charges against her. Ruby ultimately pled guilty to 4 counts of child abuse in December 2023 and was given 4 1 to 15-year sentences in prison. Hildebrandt received the same sentence, and they will both serve them consecutively. Due to a Utah law that caps the sentence duration for consecutive penalties, they will only serve 30 years max in prison, despite their sentences totaling a maximum of 60 years. At the sentencing, Hildebrandt simply stated, "I sincerely loved those children. One of the reasons I didn't go to trial is because I didn't want them to relive this. I desire for them to heal physically and emotionally." The prosecution didn't buy it. They described her as a risk to the community and noted her lack of remorse where her actions were concerned. Ruby, meanwhile, while pleading guilty, stated, "With my deepest regret and sorrow for my family and my children, guilty." At the sentencing hearing, she added, "I'll never stop crying for hurting your tender souls. My willingness to sacrifice all for you was masterfully manipulated into something very ugly. I took from you all that was soft and safe and good." About Hildebrandt, she stated, "I was led to believe the world was an evil place. For the past 4 years, I have chosen to follow counsel and guidance that have led me to a dark delusion." The Rainbow Maniac. The Rainbow Maniac is a name given to the individual who carried out the Pituras Park murders in Carapicuíba, São Paulo, Brazil, between February 2007 and August 2009. The Guardian noted that about 6 months after Pride was celebrated in São Paulo in 2008, authorities revealed that they were hunting a serial killer thought to be responsible for as many as 16 murders in the city. Generally, the Rainbow Maniac is described as being responsible for at least 13 killings, with all victims being gay men between the ages of 20 and 40. 11 of the 13 victims were shot in the head. 1 victim died from being beaten around the head, and another was shot 12 times. When discussing the latter case, police told the media that the bullets had reduced the body to a sieve. Most of the victims were attacked in Pituras Park, described as a meeting place for gay men, and as an area that is frequented by sex workers at night. 1 victim was killed in a motel room. In 2008, law enforcement was investigating whether or not 3 further deaths which had occurred in the neighboring city of Osaka was connected to the Pituras Park slayings. The local police chief at the time stated that the attacks were clearly motivated by hate. Quote, "In his head, he thinks he is doing a cleanup job. He doesn't like the homosexuals, he hates them." The first victim in this string of horrific crimes was 32-year-old Jose Henrique, killed in Pituras Park on July 4, 2007. Almost all of the deceased were found half naked, tossed into the undergrowth at the park like trash, their trousers at their knees, a .38 caliber bullet in the back of their skulls. Despite the fact that most of the victims' deaths had occurred identically it took until mid to late 2008 for investigators to realize there may be a connection between the cases, with the police noting, "The case has now gone beyond the limits of such a common crime," referring to how the cases had been treated as individual acts of violence, something commonplace in the city at the time. The police added, "We are dealing with a suspect who kills homosexuals exclusively." A team of 15 detectives was put together shortly afterwards, and to help prevent further attacks, plain-clothed police officers were sent to patrol the park at night. Additionally, ballistic testing began so that investigators could determine whether or not it was the same weapon being used across all the murders. For a brief time, a man who frequented the park was considered a suspect after he found the bodies of 3 of the 12 victims. However, gunshot residue testing was carried out on the man, and the results were negative. He subsequently began acting as a liaison with the police, and he told the media, "People know the risk, but they don't care. Paturas is our meeting place, and no one is going to stop getting it on there because of this wacko." On December 10th, 2008, a retired state police sergeant named Jairo Francisco Franco was arrested in relation to the case. Several months earlier, a witness identified him as the perpetrator of one of the murders, though Franco himself denied any and all involvement. At the time of his arrest, he was working as a private security guard in a supermarket. The police told news outlets, "We have a credible witness who says he saw Franco pump 12 bullets into a black gay man inside the park." One further witness claimed that Franco was a regular at the park, and he, quote, "apparently cruised for gay men and victims." The police later added, "We are convinced he is the rainbow maniac we have been looking for." However, though the case went to trial in 2011, the 48-year-old former sergeant was acquitted of the murders. The Paturas Park murders are still unsolved. The Atlanta Ripper. Between 1909 and 1914, the infamous Atlanta Ripper terrorized the streets of Atlanta, Georgia. Said to be responsible for the deaths of at least 15 women, the Ripper has become almost a mythical figure in the time that has passed. The Ripper is known to have targeted primarily black or mixed-race working-class women, and, like Jack the Ripper, had a tendency to mutilate his victims. The Ripper first struck in October of 1910, when he attacked 23-year-old Maggie Brooke, who was bludgeoned across the head and suffered a fractured skull. Then, on January 22nd, 35-year-old Rosa Trice's remains were discovered not far from her home. Her death was reportedly more brutal than Maggie's. Her skull had been crushed, her throat had been slashed, and she'd even been stabbed in the jaw. The Atlanta Constitution wrote that her husband was arrested for the killing, but was released shortly afterwards due to a lack of evidence. The following month, the remains of another woman were found in the woods by the West Point Belt car line. The woman is described as being black and around the age of 25, but she has never been identified. Then on May 28, 1911, the body of Belle Walker was located 25 yards from her home on Garibaldi Street. Her sister had reported her missing not long before she was found, after discovering that she had failed to return home from work. Belle's throat had been viciously slashed, and the following month, the body of Addie Watts turned up, having suffered the exact same injury. Fear gripped the black and mixed-race communities of Atlanta. The vast majority of the killings had taken place in the city's 4th Ward, where street lighting was poor and there were no trams, meaning many workers had to trudge home alone on foot in the pitch black, leaving them exposed to the killer. In his book, The Atlanta Ripper, The Unsolved Case of the Gate City's Most Infamous Murders, Jeffrey Wells wrote that many of the victims were domestic servants who worked in the homes of white employers in the old 4th Ward and the outlying areas. He added that one attack happened just down the street from the victim's employer's home, and added that the employer heard the commotion. When he emerged, he found the victim, but was not able to identify the killer. In July of 1911, 40-year-old Lena Sharp became the Ripper's next victim and produced the first possible eyewitness testimony in the killings. One newspaper from the time reported that Lena's daughter went looking for her when she was late home, aware that their neighbor had recently been killed by the Ripper. While looking for her mother, she bumped into a tall black man who told her, quote, "Don't worry, I never hurt girls like you." He then stabbed her in the back and fled the scene. However, another paper claimed that Emma Lou, Lena's daughter, had been walking with her mother when Lena was struck with a brick and Emma Lou was stabbed. The assailant then slit Lena's throat before returning to Emma Lou and standing over her with a knife. He ran from the scene when he heard footsteps approaching. Sadie Holly was found dead on July 11th, 1911, just 10 days after Lena's murder. Her injuries were so bad that she'd almost been decapitated. A suspect in Sadie's case was identified as a cab driver who'd argued with her on the night of her death and who was found with scratches on his arm and blood on his clothing. He was indicted but found not guilty because the killings continued even while he was in jail. In the second half of 1911, the bodies of Mary Ann Duncan, Eva Florence, Minnie Wise, and Mary Putnam were all located at various times. Jeffrey Wells believes that there are at least 20 victims of the serial killer, and some reports about the case note that even after 1914, the murders and mutilations of black women continued. Whether it was at the hands of the Atlanta Ripper or a new assailant is unclear. Many people have also theorized that multiple individuals were responsible for the murders, rather than a lone man. It has also been speculated that some murders attributed to the Ripper were actually done at the hands of men who wanted to get rid of their wives, that they took advantage of the hysteria and disguised domestic violence as the work of a serial killer. The Atlanta Ripper has never been identified. New Bedford Highway Killer. The New Bedford Highway Killer is the name given to a serial killer responsible for 9 deaths and 2 disappearances over the span of about a year between March 1988 and April 1989. The victims were all women, were either sex workers or people struggling with substance abuse, sometimes both, and were mostly taken from New Bedford, Massachusetts, and dumped in various surrounding towns along Route 140 after they were killed. The first known victim of the New Bedford Highway Killer was 29-year-old Robin Lynn Rhodes, sometimes referred to as Bobby Lynn. Robin's remains were found on March 29, 1989, but she was known to have disappeared approximately 1 year earlier, in March or April of 1988, leaving behind a young child. Like many of the victims, she had been struggling with drug addiction for some time, and although she was not a sex worker herself, Robin was familiar with several other victims and was even friends with one, Mary Rose Santos. She also dated one of the case's main suspects, Kenneth Ponte. Mary Rose Santos was last seen by her family on July 16, 1988, after her husband dropped her off near the downtown bus station in New Bedford. She was later seen dancing at the old quarterdeck lounge about 5 hours later. She never came home that night, and her body was recovered on March 31, 1989, along Route 88 in Westport. She had been left nude. Mary was both a sex worker and a drug addict who had recently made up with her husband after he had discovered what she had been doing to earn money. Kenneth Ponte, the same man who had dated Robin, had represented Mary in a civil case and, chillingly, helped her husband make flyers following her disappearance. After Robin's disappearance, a 28-year-old from the town of Falmouth, Massachusetts, named Rochelle Clifford Dopiorala, vanished in April 1988. She was last seen in the company of an ex-convict, the boyfriend of another victim, but he was cleared of responsibility in both cases. Rochelle's remains were found 8 months later on December 10th along Reed Road, 2 miles from Interstate 195. Again, Rochelle had a connection to Kenneth Ponte. She had briefly dated him and stayed at his house. She had also testified against another man during a rape case, which led police to suspect that this man was involved in her murder, but he was ultimately ruled out. Interestingly, Ponte had represented Rochelle during this case. In May 1988, 1 month after Rochelle disappeared, 3 women went missing. The first was Deborah Lynn McConnell, a 25-year-old who was last seen attending her mother's funeral. Deborah was the mother of a young child, and in December, 7 months after she vanished, her body was found off Route 140. She had been dumped in the undergrowth, nude, with a bra wrapped around her neck. The second woman to go missing in May 1988 was Deborah Medeiros, a 29-year-old who was reported missing on the 27th. Deborah had issues with drug abuse and was known to police for this reason. Though she lived with her mother in the city of Fall River, she went missing from New Bedford following a fight with her boyfriend. Her body was found in July 1988 on the side of the road on Interstate 40 in Freetown, making her the first victim whose remains were discovered. Her body had gone through severe decomposition, and, like Deborah McConnell, she was found with a bra wrapped around her neck. She was partially unclothed. Her cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Deborah's boyfriend was ruled out as a suspect in the case. The final woman to go missing in May 1988 was Cristina Monteiro, who was just 19 when she disappeared. Like many of the other women, she struggled with drug addiction and left behind a small child when she failed to come home. Unlike the other women, though, Cristina's body has never been found. She is still missing to this day. Her family reported that they'd last heard from her in May or June 1988, although there are reports that she was last seen in July. She vanished from New Bedford and is strongly suspected to be a victim of the New Bedford highway killer. Similarly, the next victim, Marilyn Roberts, has never been found either. Marilyn was 34 when she vanished from New Bedford. She was last heard from in April 1988, but was purportedly seen 2 months later in June. 36-year-old Nancy Lee Piver vanished after she left the Whispers pub on July 7th, following a fight with her boyfriend, which led her to walk home. She was known to have substance abuse issues, and her boyfriend at the time was a drug dealer who was familiar to the police. Their relationship was reportedly rocky, with rumors and accusations that Nancy was the victim of domestic violence. Still, when the 36-year-old's body turned up on July 30th, her boyfriend was soon ruled out as a suspect. Her nude body was recovered near Interstate 195 westbound in Dartmouth, and her cause of death was found to be strangulation. Mother of 3, Deborah Greenlaw DeMello, a 35-year-old who'd had issues with drug abuse, was last seen on July 11th after walking away from a prison work release program, which she'd been sentenced to due to a charge relating to sex work. Her remains were found off the eastbound Reed Road ramp off Interstate 195 on November 8th. Her clothing was draped across nearby tree branches, and close to the body, investigators located the belongings of the previous victim, Nancy. A 24-year-old mother of 2 named Sandra Botello was the penultimate victim of the New Bedford highway killer. She had intense drug abuse issues and a history of engaging in sex work. She was last seen on August 11th after leaving her home. Her body was the final one located in April 1989 in a wooded area along Interstate 195. Her clothes were missing, and she had been folded into a fetal position. The final victim was 25-year-old Dawn Mendez, who vanished on September 4th, 1988, while walking home alone from her work to a christening party. Like Sandra, Dawn had a history of drug abuse and sex work. Her mostly skeletal remains were found on November 29th on the westbound Reed Road ramp off Interstate 195. Over the years, there have been several suspects in the case of the New Bedford highway killer. The 2 most notable ones are Kenneth Ponte and Anthony DeGrazia. DeGrazia was a 26-year-old construction worker in 1989 who reportedly had a reputation for violence. His image was shown to a sex worker in the New Bedford area who believed he looked like a man who'd tried to choke her. Both her assailant and DeGrazia had a flattened nose, and she recalled that he'd called himself Tony. Still, she was not able to make a positive ID. The sex worker was brought in front of a secret grand jury to testify about her assault a short time later. She explained that Anthony DeGrazia looked similar to her attacker, and that a man named Tony lunged at her throat and tried snapping her neck. He then, quote, told me what he was going to do to me like he did to the other bitches. On the back of her testimony, authorities located DeGrazia and brought him in for questioning. Like Margaret, he was put before the secret grand jury, but he was never indicted. The DA at the time later asked for a warrant for his arrest, accusing DeGrazia of 17 attempted rapes and assaults on several local sex workers. DeGrazia turned himself in, where he was arrested for those charges. He spent 13 months in jail and made 18 court appearances. His lawyers repeatedly asked for documents of evidence, but were denied every time. Similarly, his lawyers asked for his bail to be lowered, as it was considered to be much too high. However, the judge declined. Finally, DeGrazia hired a new lawyer who filed a contempt on the DA's office for non-production of evidence, and the judge subsequently lowered DeGrazia's bail amount, allowing him to be released on June 27, 1990. He was shortly thereafter rearrested for allegedly making threats against the life of the DA who'd had him arrested, Ronald Pena, but DeGrazia made bail and was released once more. 1 month later, on July 17th, he was found dead at the house of his ex-girlfriend's parents. His death was initially considered a homicide by the police who attended the scene, but the DA's office later ruled the case suicide, even though the post-mortem did not support this ruling. Notably, DeGrazia's demise followed an announcement he was the new suspect in the New Bedford highway slayings after Kenneth Ponte, the previous #1 suspect, was released. Despite the media circus surrounding DeGrazia, there is nothing to tie him to the New Bedford highway murders at this time. Meanwhile, attorney Kenneth Ponte had several links to the case. He dated the first victim, Robin Rhodes, as well as Rochelle, and represented 3 other victims in civil cases. Furthermore, he had a history of drug use. He had been a heroin addict before managing to turn his life around. In the book Shallow Graves, The Hunt for the New Bedford Highway Serial Killer, Maureen Boyle wrote, quote, "The girls on the streets told stories about Ponte's paranoia, how he would bring them to his house, bolt the doors, and wouldn't let them leave. He didn't seem violent, just really strange." In August 1990, a grand jury indicted the 40-year-old in the murder of Rochelle, who was found to have been beaten to death. The DA, Ronald Pena, the same one who'd requested a warrant for Anthony DeGrazia's arrest, proposed the theory that Ponte had killed Rochelle because she was supposedly planning to expose his drug activities. Ponte was arraigned on 1 count of murder on August 17th, to which he pled not guilty. Around 1 year later, in July 1991, the DA dropped the murder charges against him, noting a lack of evidence. In 1992, the remaining charges against him, which consisted of drug use and an assault against Rochelle, were dropped also. The case against Ponte lay dormant for years until 2007, when investigators re-examined the murders and began looking into him once more. They dug up the driveway and patio of his former home in New Bedford, but found no evidence tying him to the case. Marilyn Roberts' father said, quote, "It's hope, anyway," upon seeing the investigation active again. Unfortunately, the hope was short-lived, since no new evidence emerged following this inquiry. Ponte claimed that having his name linked to the murders ruined his life and his career, stating, "When I walk up or down any street, little kids call me a murderer." In an argument with his mother and sister in 2007, he reportedly threatened to kill them both, then himself. 3 years later, he was found dead at the age of 60. Foul play has been ruled out. The case remains unsolved. If you have any information about the New Bedford highway killings or the perpetrator, you can contact the Bristol County District Attorney's Office at 508-993-2016. Or, if you have information about missing women Christina Monteiro or Marilyn Roberts, you can call the New Bedford Police Department on 508-991-6320. Gretchen Harrington. On the morning of August 15th, 1975, 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington left home to head to her summer Bible school. A resident of Broomall, Pennsylvania, Gretchen's church, the Trinity Chapel Christian Reformed Church, was not even half a mile from her home. But somewhere along the way, something happened. Gretchen never made it to Bible school. Her father was the pastor of a secondary church location and was friends with David Zanstra, the pastor of the church Gretchen was headed to that morning. After a few hours, he was alerted to his daughter's disappearance and requested that Zanstra call the authorities, which he did. An extensive search for the 8-year-old soon began, but no sign of her was found. Just short of 2 months later, on October 14th, skeletal remains were discovered in Ridley Creek State Park, not far from where Gretchen went missing. The remains were soon identified as belonging to the 8-year-old, with the cause of death being determined as injuries to the skull. The case was ruled a homicide and an investigation began, but it grew cold before long. In 2023, almost 48 years after Gretchen's murder in 1975, an arrest was finally made in her case. On July 24th, the Delaware County DA's office announced that 83-year-old David Zanstra had been charged with criminal homicide of the first, second, and third degree, as well as kidnapping of a minor and possession of an instrument of crime. The break in the case came just 1 week earlier, when investigators decided to re-interview Zanstra, the pastor of the church Gretchen was attending on the day of her disappearance. Chillingly, not only was Zanstra a devoted family friend, but one of his daughters was Gretchen's closest companion. Police noted that during their 2023 interview with him, he initially denied being involved. However, when he was confronted with evidence of sexual misconduct in the past, he broke down, telling detectives that he had seen the little girl walking alone on the road on the morning that she went missing. Zanstra claimed that he offered Gretchen a lift to the church, which she accepted because she knew and trusted him. Instead, he took her to a nearby wooded area where he parked the car and asked her to remove her clothing. The 8-year-old refused, however, much to his anger. He struck Gretchen with his fist, leaving her bleeding. Believing she was dead, he covered up her body and fled the scene. DA Jack Stolzheimer labeled Zanstra as a monster, stating, "This is a man who was a remorseless child predator who acted as if he was a friend, a neighbor, and a man of God, and he killed this poor little girl." He added that Zanstra played the part of a family friend for years after Gretchen's death. Investigators had decided to revisit Zanstra when, in the autumn of 2022, a woman came forward wishing to speak to somebody about Gretchen's case. When connected with an officer, the woman stated that she thought she knew who the killer was. Remarkably, she had diaries she'd kept from the 1970s, in which she'd written down some of this information. She had been just 10 at the time of the murder, and lived in Haverton, around 3 miles east of where Gretchen went missing. This woman had, as a child, also been friends with one of Zanstra's daughters. She recalled sleeping over at their house frequently, and told police that one time she awoke in the middle of the night to find Zanstra molesting her. When she moved, he hurriedly exited the room, but he came back the next night to do it again. When she asked her friend, Zanstra's daughter, about his actions, she replied, "He does that sometimes." When she got home, she told her parents about the incident. They immediately forbade her from sleeping over at the pastor's house. In her diaries, the woman also wrote about an abduction involving a friend of hers named Holly. She wrote, "Guess what? A man tried to kidnap Holly twice. It's a secret, so I can't tell anyone, but I think he might be the one who kidnapped Gretchen. I think it was Mr. Z." Witnesses on the day of Gretchen's disappearance had seen her speaking with a man inside a car. Some eyewitness accounts claimed the car matched Zanstra's. Still, investigators back then had been unable to concretely connect the pastor to the crime. DNA was collected from Zanstra at the time of his 2023 arrest, and it will be submitted to see if it matches any open and unsolved cases. Investigators have expressed their concerns that due to his role as a pastor, Zanstra could have abused many more children. Laura Kempton. 23-year-old Laura Kempton was found dead on September 28, 1981. She had last been seen in the early hours of that morning entering her home, a ground-floor apartment on Chapel Street in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Her body was discovered by a police officer who had come to serve her a court summons related to unpaid parking tickets when he noticed that the front door showed signs of a break-in and spotted a body through the half-open door. The crime was heinous. Laura had been covered by a mattress and bedding, her ankles tied by an electrical cord. She had been sexually assaulted before death. Authorities added that it was likely a wine bottle which was used to attack Laura before, during, or after the assault. Laura was a student at the Portsmouth Beauty School, where she was studying to become a hairdresser. She was also an employee at the Marco Polo gift store and Karen's ice cream parlor. Hardworking and social, she was known to be a free spirit with a big personality. Investigators who began to look into her demise discovered that she likely died shortly after arriving home. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the side of the head. For weeks, detectives attempted to chase down leads and understand the murder, but weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. Answers were still out of reach. The case went cold. Then, in 2023, an announcement came. Laura's killer had been identified. Ronnie James Lee was a 21-year-old man living and working in Portsmouth at the time of the murder. Assistant Attorney General Rachel Harrington noted that there was no evidence that the two knew each other. Lee was born in 1960 and served briefly in the military until 1981, before he began working for MBI Security at Liberty Mutual in Portsmouth. In November 1982, he was arrested for theft. He was living with his mother at the time. Laura's murder wasn't his only crime. Lee had been convicted of a string of offenses, including 5 burglaries, 2 of which he pled guilty to, as well as sexual assault. In 1987, he was convicted of the latter case, which stemmed from another burglary. He was in prison for 3 years following the conviction. While Lee cannot be charged in the case, investigators now consider the murder solved. Lee died in 2005, aged 45, of acute cocaine intoxication. Had he lived, he would currently be facing first-degree murder charges. Ruth Marie Terry, formerly known as the Lady of the Dunes. On July 26, 1974, the decomposing body of a woman was found in Race Point Dunes, Provincetown, Massachusetts. She was found amongst shrubbery, yards away from a road, and was believed to have died 2 weeks prior. She was lying face down on half of a beach blanket. Investigators theorized that she knew her killer, or had been killed while she was asleep, due to the fact that she had no defensive injuries and there were no other obvious signs of a struggle. She was described as being around 5'6" and weighing 145 pounds, with red hair pulled back into a ponytail. Her toes were painted pink, and she had been located with a blue bandana and a pair of Wrangler-branded jeans placed beneath her head. She had had a lot of expensive dental work done, but was missing several teeth, as well as her hands and one forearm, likely to prevent identification via fingerprinting and dental work. She was estimated to be as young as 20 or as old as 49. Jane Doe's cause of death was determined to be head injury. One side of her head had been crushed, possibly with a military-type entrenching tool. She was nearly decapitated, and her body bore signs of sexual assault, most likely post-mortem. It wasn't long before investigators hit a dead end in the investigation, however, unable to put a name to Jane Doe's face. She was buried in October 1974 and dubbed the Lady of the Dunes. The case lay dormant for several decades until 2015, when suggestions emerged that the Lady of the Dunes was an extra in Jaws, the 1975 Steven Spielberg classic. The film had been shot on Martha's Vineyard, around 100 miles south of Provincetown. There was an extra in the film's 4th of July beach scene, which shows a woman wearing a blue bandana and jeans, similar to those described as being found with the body. Nothing further came of this lead, however. Once more, years went by with no progress. Finally, in 2022, Orthram Inc., a corporation specializing in forensic genetic genealogy, began testing the Lady of the Dunes' skeletal remains. On October 31st, the FBI announced that, at long last, Jane Doe had been identified. Ruth Marie Terry was born on September 8, 1936, in Whitwell, Tennessee. Not much is known about her upbringing, but in 1957, aged 21 and following a brief marriage, she moved to Livonia, Michigan, where she began working at Fisher Body Automotive Plant. Her sister-in-law, Jan Terry, recalled, "She loved her family, and her family loved her." Her brother, Ken, described her as a free spirit, adding, "She was looking for something more than just a country life, I guess you'd say." A year later, in 1958, Ruth gave birth to her son, Richard, but could not afford to care for him. She agreed to let the superintendent at her workplace adopt him in exchange for paying off her expenses. He and his wife were close friends of Ruth's. Once this process was finalized, she moved to California. Though she reached out to her son in 1972, he was a teenager at the time and was not ready to connect with her. At some point in the next few years, Ruth met Guy Rockwell Moldavin. The pair tied the knot on February 16, 1974. Moldavin was an antiques dealer in Reno, Nevada, but her family reported taking a dislike to him when they finally met. 4 months before her body was found in Provincetown, Ruth visited her family. Her grandniece recalled that the 38-year-old wasn't herself when she was in her husband's company. Family members also observed Moldavin's possessive behavior. The couple then journeyed to Chattanooga, Tennessee to visit her brother Ken, who recalled that Moldavin and Ruth had spoken about traveling around the country to pick up antiques, and they discussed visiting Massachusetts. Then, in the late summer of 1974, Moldavin came back to Tennessee. He told Ruth's family that she had gone missing from their shared home in California. Ruth's sister-in-law, Jan, noted, "He was so blunt, and he just said he didn't know where she was and all that, but he didn't stay very long." Ruth's other brother, James, journeyed to California, where he hired a private investigator to track down his sister. The PI revealed that all of her belongings had been sold, and suggested that she had left the state of her own volition after becoming involved with a religious cult. One family member theorized that Ruth had gone into a witness protection program and was unable to contact her loved ones. Richard Hanchett, Ruth's son, told the Californian, "They couldn't find anything. They confronted that Moldavin guy, and he just said she left. You know, free-spirited this, that, and the other." Meanwhile, Ruth's sister-in-law stated, "I always had a bad feeling about the guy she married." For decades, the Terrys went without answers. When the announcement came that she had been identified in 2022, her family was relieved. At least now they knew, and they could finally find a sense of closure. A month following the identification, investigators began looking into Moldavin, believing he was the last person to see her alive. They first noted that in 1974, Moldavin was driving Ruth's car and had told several people that she was dead. They then learned of his extensive criminal past. Moldavin was born on October 27, 1923. In 1958, he married his second wife, Manzanita Ryan, who disappeared along with her 18-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, Dolores Mearns, in April 1960. Moldavin was the prime suspect in the case and fled Seattle shortly after the disappearance, but was later apprehended by the FBI. True crime writer Anne Rule alleged in her 2007 book, Smoke, Mirror, and Murder, that police found body parts in Moldavin's septic tank, but were unable to prove they were from the missing women. Prosecutors were reluctant to press charges without a body, and so he was never charged in connection with the disappearances. Moldavin married for a third time on July 29, 1960. Shortly afterwards, he faced larceny charges for stealing $10,000 from his second wife's family around the time she and her daughter went missing, and in 1961, he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Unfortunately, however, a judge suspended that sentence in March of 1962 on the condition that Moldavin repay the money. In 2023, investigators announced that Moldavin had been identified as Ruth's killer. He cannot be charged because he died in 2002, aged 78, but investigators now consider Ruth's case closed. One cold December night in 1996, a 12-year-old girl went missing from her New Jersey home. Heavily pregnant and just weeks from her due date, nobody could understand why the young girl would leave home in the middle of the night, or why anybody would want to harm her. The case, on the surface, seems troubling enough, but digging deeper into the circumstances of the girl's life revealed even more concerning information, including a strict, cult-like church, an overbearing tyrant of an aunt, and several family members who seemed desperate to keep the truth hidden. On December 15th, 1996, 12-year-old Selena Jeanette Mays attended church with her family. Later that evening, she ate ice cream with her loved ones at the shared home on Crestville Drive in Willingboro, New Jersey. Afterwards, at around 11 p.m., she put her dishes in the sink and kissed her family members goodnight before retreating to bed. Her family initially noted in the days before she vanished, nothing seemed amiss. Selena's mood was stable and her behavior was perfectly normal. But her stepmother, Yvette Mays, would later recall that Selena had said, "Thanks for everything," before heading to bed. In hindsight, she realized that this may have been the 12-year-old's way of saying goodbye. The following morning, Selena's 4-year-old stepsister, Nori Mays, was sent to wake her for breakfast. When she didn't respond, the little girl approached the bed and pulled back the covers, surprised to find pillows neatly arranged beneath the sheets, made to look like there was a figure sleeping beneath them. If Selena had gone voluntarily, she had taken nothing with her. Her bag, prenatal vitamins, and CD player had all been left behind. By all accounts, she had left with the clothing on her back, a red coat, and nothing more. Selena has never been seen or heard from again. She was reported missing a day later, on December 17th, but it would be several more days before the police were informed that the 12-year-old they were looking for was heavily pregnant. At the time she went missing, Selena was 9 months pregnant. Her unborn baby was due around December 29th, just 2 weeks after she went missing. Her family stressed that it was vital that she be found, as she would likely need to deliver the baby by C-section. According to reports, the 12-year-old would not reveal the identity of the baby's father, though she allegedly told her father that her boyfriend was 16 years old and not a member of her church. It's possible she decided not to reveal his name because she knew he would get in trouble. The baby's father could be charged with rape, since Selena was a child when she became pregnant. Selena's father, CJ, recalled that the 12-year-old had become upset when she learned that tests done on the baby could help identify the father. Some family members later theorized that Selena had left of her own volition in order to avoid the baby being tested and thus revealing the identity of its parent. Despite the fact that Selena was just 12 and that having a baby so young was a huge risk for her health, her family objected to the idea of getting an abortion when she first discovered she was pregnant because of their religion. CJ was employed as an accountant and bookkeeper for the Gospel of Christ Ministry, a small Pentecostal church based in Mount Holly, New Jersey, where his sister, Sarita Smith, was the pastor and Selena was raised as a member. Selena was also homeschooled and instilled with strict religious values throughout her childhood, as were her cousins and step-siblings, while many of the adults worked at the church. The congregation reportedly consisted of around 50 to 60 members, many of them extended families. It was common practice in the church for members to live on church property in large groups. Selena herself lived with about 15 other people at her 4-bedroom Willingboro residence. The church was insular and sheltered. Children were not allowed to mingle with the outside world and gained all their knowledge about life from the carefully curated and deeply religious words approved by Sarita. In 1991, however, the Gospel of Christ was removed as a member church of Christ Gospel Ministries International in Jeffersonville, Indiana, after an investigation was done into its pastor, and it was found that Sarita ran the church with an authoritarian style. A spokesperson later stated that, quote, "Their philosophy of church leadership and her management of financial matters is incompatible with our philosophy and policies." Interestingly, the church also had numerous complaints from former members made against it during the 90s. Many claimed it was utilizing brainwashing techniques on its congregation. Some members of the church were physically, forcibly removed by family members who felt that they were in too deep. Sarita, though, shot back at these accusations by alleging that upset and angry former church members had kidnapped Selena and were hiding her from her family. According to the Burlington County Times, Sarita rarely spoke to the police following the disappearance of her niece. She also denied police requests that would allow them to search the church and the family home. Furthermore, a warrant to search Selena's family residence was denied after a judge ruled that the Mays could be considered victims. The family had reportedly alleged that the police had been biased against them during an earlier interview. CJ's side of the family, including Sarita, cooperated very little with police at the time, as did their church congregation. Sarita has since died, and after CJ passed away in 2019, the Mays moved out of the family home from which Selena disappeared. It's unclear where they now live. The church building, where the Gospel of Christ ministry once was, has been abandoned for over 10 years. One resident of Willingboro recalled that following Selena's disappearance, the entire town talked about it. Many parents warned their children to stay away from the church. Further accusations at the time of the disappearance came from Selena's mother's side of the family. Selena's mother, Lynn Marie Vital, died of a brain aneurysm in 1994. Following her death, her family attempted to gain custody of Selena, citing numerous incidents of drug and domestic abuse CJ had carried out against Lynn before her death. CJ, for his part, argued by this time that he had found faith and was a new man. He was ultimately given custody of his daughter, and the pair moved to Willingboro. After Selena went missing, her maternal relatives accused the Mays of hiding her. Meanwhile, the Mays accused the Vital family of taking her back to Florida or Michigan, where they were originally from, as they still wanted custody of the young girl. Nori Mays, the 4-year-old stepsister of Selena, who discovered that she was missing, recalled that nobody talked about her 12-year-old stepsister after she vanished. When she was just 8, Nori began asking questions, but answers were often vague and evasive. When the media approached the family for comment, Sarita would often stop members of the family from talking. Nori remembered that one time she was told that Selena was gone because Selena slept around, got pregnant, and ran away. Later, in 2024, Nori spoke with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and discussed the tight grasp her aunt Sarita had on the family. She stated that Sarita ran the church like a cult, and that many of the family members involved in it were stuck with nowhere to go. Quote, "My aunt dictated my parents' marriage and everyone else's and their kids. I do not judge my dad or my mum for their inability to act out against the church. They were afraid, but they did everything they could to help Selena." Nori also claimed that she once heard a theory that she hopes is true, that Selena's mother, Lynn, before her death, organized for a woman to help the young girl escape the church and move her somewhere where she would never be found. In the weeks following Selena's disappearance, the police issued flyers, spoke with the local community, and combed through nearby areas for any clues that would lead them to the 12-year-old. Around the time of her due date, they began contacting hospitals, hoping the young girl had been admitted and was giving birth in the care of professionals, but nobody had seen Selena, and her whereabouts remained unknown. On January 25, 1997, the owner of a Sizzler's restaurant in Howell told police that he believed he had seen Selena dining as part of a group. He described her as no longer being pregnant and said that she was in the company of several people, including a pastor and a photographer. Although initially this seemed like a promising lead, the police eventually determined that the girl seen by the restaurant owner was not Selena. Over 250 leads have sprung up over the years, but none have panned out. Some of Selena's family members believe it is very unlikely that she is still alive. Her maternal aunt, Cindy Cram, told the Burlington County Times, "My feeling about it right away was she's not alive. Sometimes you go with your gut feeling, and I still don't feel that she was alive. I think they shut her up." The "they" in question is implied to be the Mays family and their church. An aunt of Selena's believed that the father of her child was an unidentified individual the young girl had met while out skating in Camden County, New Jersey. Though this seems odd, given that Selena's life was sheltered and controlled, it is difficult to think when she would have the time, unsupervised, to spend with a boy or a man. Rumors swirled at the time that one of Selena's own cousins, Sean Smith, the 21-year-old son of Sarita, was responsible for abusing and impregnating her. He was reportedly interviewed multiple times after the disappearance, but denied knowing where she was or being involved in her disappearance. A girl who was just a few years older than Selena at the time of her disappearance recalled that she had been repeatedly sexually assaulted by Sean as a minor, and claimed that Selena confessed the same thing had happened to her shortly before she fell pregnant. Furthermore, in 1998, Sean was arrested after sexually assaulting two girls from the ages of 13 and 14. The assaults began in 92 and 93, respectively. He ultimately fathered 7 children by 4 different women, most of whom were church members. Unfortunately, Sean is now deceased, having passed away in 2020 at the age of 46, which leaves many questions unanswered. To this day, the identity of the father of Selena's child is still unknown, as is what happened to the baby and Selena herself following her disappearance. One relative suggested that the baby's father killed her to stop his identity from being discovered. Another speculated that she was the victim of an amateur abortion gone wrong. Over the last several decades, Selena's case file has often switched hands between detectives. Willingboro detective Monica Pogorzelski has said that the police remain determined to see the case through. Quote, "This isn't just something that got pushed to the side. It's been continually investigated, and whenever leads come up, we follow and go, and just nothing turns up of any evidentiary purposes to go further." In 2021, the Willingboro Police Department revealed a renewed effort to solve the case, noting, quote, "In 1996, we had limited resources to communicate with the public and acquire details regarding missing persons. Social media has evolved greatly and can now reach a wide variety of people quickly through many platforms. We are using social media to distribute information about Selena to raise awareness of her case. We are hopeful that social media will be a beneficial tool in finding new information about the disappearance of Selena Mays. In the years since she went missing, there have been several sightings of Selena in locations such as Lacey Township and Hopewell Township, both in New Jersey, but they have never been confirmed. Following her death, Selena's mother Lynn left her a large life insurance policy, which she will now be more than old enough to collect if she is still alive. 12-year-old Selena Jeanette Mays was last seen on the evening of December 15th, 1996, at her home in Crestview Drive in Willingboro, New Jersey. She is described as a mixed-race girl who is half African-American and half white, with brown eyes and long, black, curly hair. At the time of her disappearance, she was 5 foot tall, around 120 pounds, and also heavily pregnant. She was possibly wearing a long red coat when she went missing, as this item of clothing was gone from her room. If Selena is still alive, she will be 40 years old, and her baby will be 27. If you have any information about Selena's case, you can contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-843-5678. Alternatively, you can call the Willingboro Police Department at 609-877-3001. Described as an independent woman and devoted mother, 43-year-old Susan Osborne thought she had hit the jackpot in 2017. She was living in Holtville, Alabama, with her son, her 2 dogs, and her husband of 3 years, Jerry Osborne. By all accounts, she was content in life. But then she went missing, alongside her son, 14-year-old Evan Chartrand. And as investigators dug deeper into the lives of Susan and her family, it came to light that all was not as it seemed. Susan was originally from Michigan, but moved to Alabama in 2005 after marrying the father of her first child, Evan. Even though they divorced shortly afterwards, the mother of one decided not to return to her home state, despite being far away from her extended family. Eventually, Susan met another man and gave birth to a daughter. However, the relationship disintegrated around 2009. Another 5 years would pass before a new opportunity for love arose in the form of Jerry Osborne, an Air Force veteran and 911 dispatcher. Susan admired how good he was with her children, and she saw him as generous and gentle. On January 25, 2014, the pair tied the knot, and the family moved to Holtville, where Jerry had purchased a home on Waterview Lane near Highway 111. At first, Jerry seemed like a cautious and protective man. He had an intricate and high-tech security system installed in the home and several CCTV cameras. But, as friends and family would later notice, it seemed that Jerry's vigilant behavior began crossing into the territory of controlling. By 2015, Susan had started distancing herself from her loved ones. They would later discover that this was because her new husband was monitoring her calls and texts. Similarly, Susan's brother Brian reported that in January 2015, she and her family came to visit her ill father and planned to go ice fishing later on during the trip. Both Susan and 14-year-old Evan loved to fish. However, the family never showed up to their scheduled activity. Instead, Susan messaged Brian to tell him she, Jerry, and the children were on their way back to Alabama. Her family never got to say goodbye. Loved ones also added that at the time of Susan and Evan's disappearance in 2017, they'd met Jerry less than a handful of times. In 2016, Susan grew concerned when she discovered a photo of her husband on Craigslist, advertising himself as a male escort. She recognized him by his distinguishable tattoos. She believed that he was working as an escort behind her back and emailed a friend to admit to what she'd found. She stated that she was going to start preparing to leave Jerry, noting that she'd need to get a job so that her children would receive health insurance and secure somewhere to stay. Susan also asked her friend not to mention any of this by text, confessing that Jerry read all of her messages. The friend Susan contacted, Holly Morris, had reportedly been afraid for the safety of Susan and her children for some time and encouraged her to leave. Holly and Susan had met 9 years earlier when they lived in the same neighborhood and had remained best friends even after Susan moved to Holtville. Despite her concerns and plans though, Susan never left Jerry. She emailed Holly sometime after her initial message and stated that she and Jerry had worked things out and that she still loved him and wanted to give things another go. Holly remained worried, but recognized there was only so much she could say to her friend to encourage her to go. For Mother's Day in May 2017, Susan's mother Linda traveled to Alabama to visit her and the children. Their time together was noted to have been completely normal. Similarly, on May 16th, Susan and Jerry helped Holly and her fiancé finish packing. The couple planned to move out to Florida as part of Holly's fiancé's job. 10 days later, on May 26th, Susan spent time with her daughter, who was not living with her at the time, though Susan had visitation rights. The next day, she spoke with Holly on the phone and noted that Evan was off school because he was sick. The two spoke again the following day and exchanged a few texts the day after that, on the 29th. Then, all communication with Susan and Evan ceased. Holly, for her part, thought that Susan was simply busy. Life sometimes got in the way of their communication, but never for that long. Susan's mother became alarmed when she was repeatedly unable to reach her daughter or her grandson as the weeks passed. While at first she brushed off their lack of communication as a phone bill that hadn't been paid, or maybe even a broken phone, the knot of worry in her stomach became more and more pronounced as time went by. Linda eventually decided to send her daughter an old-fashioned letter, but it came back as undelivered. 2 months had passed before Evan and Susan were officially reported missing on July 29, 2017. 2 days later, on July 31st, officers from the Elmore County Sheriff's Office visited the family's residence in Holtville to carry out a welfare check. Upon their arrival, they spotted Susan's car still in the driveway. Jerry was the one to answer the front door, explaining that he was in the middle of cleaning. A strong smell of incense and candles wafted out from inside the building, and there was a burn barrel alight in the back garden. When pressed about the whereabouts of his wife and stepchild, Jerry told investigators that he and Susan had fought on Memorial Day, May 27th, and that she and Evan had climbed into a truck with a man he didn't know and hadn't come home. He said he believed they were heading to Birmingham, and noted that the driver never left the vehicle, although he was able to describe him as 6 foot tall with a beard and sunglasses. Jerry then claimed he'd gone to visit his parents, and that when he had returned, Evan and Susan's belongings were gone, and they had vandalized the home, spray painting rude words on the floors and walls. This, he claimed, was the reason he had repainted some of the walls and replaced some of the flooring with new carpet. After the officers left, Holly contacted them and told them all she knew, from Jerry's red flags to the incident with the escort advertisement to the couple's reconciliation. With this information in hand, investigators obtained a search warrant that same day and returned to the house. This time, though, they came armed with luminol, which showed that no matter how much cleaning had been done, evidence of a crime remained. Numerous possible bloodstains, approximately 20 according to the Charlie Project, were located inside the home and were subsequently sent for DNA testing. Sheriff Bill Franklin told True Crime Daily that the amount of blood indicated great violence had taken place inside the home. Most of the stains appeared in the bedrooms and bathrooms, and Jerry had admitted to burning several items in the garden, including Evan's bed. Furthermore, authorities noticed that a new security system had been installed, and there was no footage available from the day that Susan and Evan supposedly left, or from the day they allegedly came back to collect their belongings and vandalize the home. Investigators later confirmed that electronics had been seized from the residence, adding that the search history on the computer taken was not what they'd have expected from an average person. Unfortunately for investigators, the DNA testing on the bloodstains was inconclusive due to the cleaning chemicals used. Still, authorities continued to search for clues. They found out that on June 1st, Jerry had dropped Susan's dogs off at a shelter and changed his security system. 3 days later, he started picking up renovation supplies. Then on July 1st, over a month after the disappearance, he filed for divorce. The divorce was granted on November 15th. It has been noted that there were some inconsistencies in Jerry's story, with small details, including the color of the spray paint Susan used to deface the house, and the type of vehicle she and her son left in. These details changed throughout his numerous interviews. Upon speaking with neighbors, law enforcement discovered that Jerry had begun burning things in the back garden on Memorial Day weekend. The remnants of Evan's bed, smashed up and charred, were discovered, with neighbors adding that there was a strong smell of plastic in the neighborhood as Jerry burned items. While scent dogs were brought in to help find any useful evidence, and the dogs led their handlers to the burn barrel, nothing damning was discovered inside it. Since Susan's disappearance, there has been no activity on her phone, credit cards, or social media. Likewise, Evan's phone and social media have laid dormant since he went missing. He has also not been registered at other schools, and his prescriptions have not been refilled. Furthermore, he was due to undergo dental surgery shortly after he went missing, and never made his appointment. Susan's friend Holly noted that despite Jerry's story, there was no other man in her life, and added that she had changed her mind about leaving her husband, so why would she just take off one day? Holly doesn't believe that Susan left of her own volition, telling the Wetumpka Herald in 2018 she would not just disappear, she wouldn't have left her 10-year-old daughter, she wouldn't go without talking to her and seeing her. She also has theorized that the email she had received from Susan, in which she claimed she had reconciled with her husband, may have been written and sent by Jerry. Susan's other loved ones have echoed similar sentiments, pointing out that the 43-year-old was a devoted pet parent and wouldn't simply abandon her 2 dogs either. Several areas around the family home were searched in the months following the disappearance, but no new clues have been found to help law enforcement bring the case to a close. No suspects have been named in the case, and Jerry Osborne remains the only person of interest, though he has maintained his innocence since 2017. Captain Troy Evans of the Elmore County Sheriff's Office told AL.com, "There were several pieces of evidence and several things that were odd and seemed to point in a certain direction. Obviously, nothing to the degree that we had probable cause." He also discussed law enforcement's search efforts, stating, "We searched the immediate area around the house, the neighborhood, and the wooded areas there. Every theory and every option that has come available to us or that has come to our attention, we have tried to rule those out, and so far have alleviated all of those." Captain Evans also declined to call the case cold, noting, "To me, that insinuates it's just sitting somewhere and we're not doing anything on it. We're still monitoring news media sources. Anytime there's a body found around the area, we do try to reach out to the law enforcement agency and just make sure they're aware of what we've got. I mean, it's not something we're actively doing stuff on every day, but, as things come up, we're still trying to do as much as we can." Jerry has never been charged in connection with the case. He remained at the home on Waterview Lane until early 2020, having put the building up for sale on December 14th, 2019. It sold 3 months later. As of 2021, he was living 30 minutes from Holtville with another woman and her children. The pair got engaged on January 25th, 2020, the same day he had married Susan in 2014. 43-year-old Susan Lynn Osborne and her son, 14-year-old Evan Eric Chartrand, have been missing since May 29, 2017, from Holtville, Alabama. Susan is described as a white woman with brown hair, blue eyes, and pierced ears. She is 5'3" and weighed 120 pounds when she was last seen. Her son, Evan, is described as a white male with brown hair and blue eyes. At the time of his disappearance, he was 5'7" and weighed 160 pounds. Evan is noted to have medical issues which require prescription medication and regular doctor visits. Foul play is suspected in both cases. If you have any information about the disappearance of Susan Osborne or her son Evan Chartrand, you can contact the Elmore County Sheriff's Department at 334-567-5546. Alternatively, you can call Crime Stoppers at 334-251-7867. I am not a citizen with great influence. I am simply a grieving mother who wants to keep this case in the public light in hopes that one day someone will come forward with some information in what happened to my son. Those are the words of Anne Mackenzie, whose son suddenly vanished one day while at work in 2002. For 2 decades, she has searched for answers, and for 2 decades, those answers have eluded her. Christopher Tompkins was just 20 at the time of his disappearance, and his case has become one of the most baffling in Harris County history. Born on December 28, 1981, Christopher Carlton Tompkins was described by his loved ones as a happy, outgoing, and hard-working young man. A devout Christian, he lived with his mother, Anne, in Ellerslie, Georgia, and by all accounts, the pair had a strong bond. Christopher was last seen on January 25, 2002. At the time, the 20-year-old worked as part of a 4-man team of surveyors, a job he reportedly enjoyed. He showed up to begin his shift after 8 a.m. and journeyed with one of his co-workers to their job site near County Line Road in Harris County, Georgia. Throughout the morning, the 4 men worked in a line, spaced approximately 50 feet apart from one another. The area they were working in appears to be rather densely wooded. In the early afternoon, the 4 men stopped for lunch. At around 1 p.m., they began work again. They looked away from Christopher for just a moment, and by the time they looked back, the 20-year-old was gone. His tools were on the ground, but the man himself had vanished. Christopher's colleagues were, by all accounts, baffled as to what had just happened. They didn't see or hear anything odd, and so they speculated that he had walked further into the woods for some reason, possibly to relieve himself. However, as the minutes passed, and Christopher failed to return, they grew concerned and began a search of the area, all while calling his name. Despite their efforts, no trace of Christopher was found. For unknown reasons, Christopher's mother wasn't informed of the disappearance until 4:15 that afternoon. There are mixed reports about who contacted the police first. Some sources state that Christopher's colleagues or boss did, but others state that it was his mother who called first. Either way, they were informed that a missing persons report could not be filed until 24 hours had elapsed. Since investigators wouldn't start looking for Christopher, his family began search efforts instead. They quickly discovered a worker's boot hanging from the top of a barbed wire fence in the area the men were working in, and it was confirmed as belonging to Christopher. On that same fence, they recovered a blue thread, likely from the 20-year-old's trousers. 12 cents were discovered on the ground, believed to have fallen from his pocket. Christopher's other boot would be found 5 months after he went missing, recovered by a farmer who found it in a swampy area of his land. The boot was about half a mile from where he disappeared. There were no signs of a struggle, and there was nothing to indicate where he might have gone or what might have happened to him. In the 20 years since Christopher vanished, no further evidence has come to light in his case. While the police spoke with the 20-year-old's colleagues, they didn't seem to garner any useful information. His boss reportedly told investigators that he'd been acting strangely in the days leading up to his disappearance, but it's unclear what was meant by this, as he did not elaborate on what sort of behaviors Christopher was exhibiting. Notably, Anne Mackenzie rejects this information, noting that her son had been behaving perfectly normal in the days before he vanished. She told WTVM that the morning of January 25th, 2002 had been like any other. They both headed to work together. Anne worked as a babysitter for Christopher's boss at around 8:10 a.m. She told authorities, "Chris lived with me and I saw him every day. There was neither strange behavior on his part nor any distress." Christopher's case was eventually closed. There was no sign of foul play, injury, or animal attack, and authorities concluded that the 20-year-old had simply decided to start a new life. Harris County Sheriff at the time, Mikey Jolie, said, "He walked off the job site, which was consistent with what the co-worker said, walked through the woods, went over towards the interstate. We believe that he got into an automobile and just left the area." Jolie noted, though, that his opinion changed when Christopher failed to contact his mother. He told WTVM, "My biggest fear is that when he came up missing in 2002, he went to a large city. Right after he came up missing, he might have overdosed or something else might have happened to him. Because he had no identification on him, that city went ahead and disposed of the body." Christopher's family, though, don't believe either of law enforcement's theories. His aunt, Rosalind, noted that he didn't have a drug problem and that she didn't believe the 20-year-old had just walked away. "I don't believe he disappeared with one shoe. Who's going to walk around with one boot on in the cold weather on a rural road? I don't believe that happened. They know what happened to Chris, they just not telling." The police never considered Christopher's colleagues suspects or persons of interest, despite them being the last people to see the young man alive before he vanished. One of the men retained a lawyer shortly after the disappearance, which has led to some suspicion in online true crime circles, but it is often said that hiring a lawyer before engaging with police is good practice, regardless of whether one is guilty or not. More notable is the fact that one of his co-workers was sentenced to prison for what is only described as a violent crime conviction, just months after the 20-year-old went missing. The names of the 3 men have never been made public, so finding out the exact nature of this violent crime is not possible at this time. There are 4 main theories about what became of Christopher: that he left to start a new life, that he met with an accident which was possibly covered up by his co-workers, that he had an accident, became disoriented and got lost, or that he met with foul play, possibly at the hands of his co-workers. His mother believes that he will never come home, stating, "I truly believe in my heart that my son is no longer alive. However, I need closure. I need to know what happened that day and where my son's body is." 20-year-old Christopher Tompkins was last seen on January 25, 2002, near County Line Road in Harris County, Georgia. He is described as an African-American male with black hair and brown eyes. At the time of his disappearance, he weighed 130 pounds, and his hair was braided. He may have a mustache, beard, or goatee, and his height is between 5'7" and 5'9". Christopher has an ice cream cone tattoo on his right arm, with the name Chris written vertically inside the design. The opening of the cone contains the head of a joker wearing a hat. When Christopher was last seen, he wore a black shirt, a blue and grey plaid jacket with a grey hood, navy blue work trousers by the brand Dickies, tan FUBU work boots, a black skullcap, and a black watch. If he is still alive, he will be 43 years old in December. If you have any information about Christopher's disappearance, you can contact the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Greenville office at 706-655-5842. Alternatively, you can contact the GBI tip line at 800-597-8477. In the summer of 2001, a teenage boy went missing on his way to work, never to be seen again. In the years since, there have been no leads, no physical evidence, and no inkling as to what became of Jason Jalkowski. The lack of answers in this case has led it to become one of the most bizarre, chilling, and unexplained mysteries in Nebraska's history. Jason Anthony Jalkowski was born on June 24, 1981, in the city of Grand Island, Nebraska. He was the eldest of two sons, born to Kelly Murphy and Jim Jalkowski, and by all accounts lived an average, happy childhood. Though he dealt with a mild learning disability, described as relating to speech and language, Jason was known to be extremely intelligent. He graduated from Benson High School in Omaha and went on to attend Iowa Western Community College in Council Bluffs. He dreamt of becoming a DJ following his university graduation and was enrolled in its radio broadcasting program as a part-time student. To earn money, he worked part-time at Fazoli's, an Italian-American restaurant chain on the 80th and Cass Streets in Omaha. His mother called him shy and a quiet boy with a small handful of friends. She also noted that he was unusually polite and would go out of his way to help others. Jason was last seen on June 13, 2001. As it was the summer holidays, he and his 13-year-old brother, Michael, were left home alone together while their parents went to work that day. In the morning, his boss called him and asked him to come in early. Jason agreed, but his car was in the shop, so his boss suggested that he send one of his co-workers to pick him up. They arranged to meet at 11 a.m. at his old high school's parking lot, as Jason could walk there easily. For the next short while, Jason finished up some chores and prepared to head to work. A neighbor spotted him at 10:45 a.m., helping Michael bring in the empty bins from the side of the road and put them back in their garage. He then set off from his home in the area of 48th and Bedford Streets in the direction of Benson High. Jason's disappearance was noticed before long. He failed to show up to meet his co-worker at 11 a.m., so they called his house between 11:15 and 11:30 to find out where he was. Jason has never been seen or heard from since his abrupt vanishing that day. His parents mistakenly believed that they had to wait 24 hours before reporting him missing, so they didn't contact the police until the following morning. Investigators initially suspected that Jason was a teenage runaway, that he had left in some sort of emotional, angsty mood and would come home again when he was ready. Due to this fact, they unfortunately did not start investigating his disappearance until 10 days after he was last seen. To kick the investigation off, law enforcement began interviewing neighbors and conducted ground searches for any clues, but found nothing. CCTV cameras around the school showed that the 19-year-old never made it to Benson High. He had only needed to walk 7 blocks between his house and the school, and the area he would have traveled through was quiet, with little traffic. Jason left behind $650 in his bank account, which remains untouched. Similarly, he has not cashed any of his paychecks, his debit card hasn't been used, his mobile phone hasn't been touched, and he never picked up his car from the garage. His parents noted that he was due to start a new job the week after he went missing, and that he was very much looking forward to it. He had been in good spirits and was not involved with anyone romantically at the time he went missing. He did not do drugs or drink alcohol and has no history of running away. He also has no known enemies. When he left the house on June 13, 2001, he carried no more than $60 on him and had left behind his clothing and other effects, though he was known to have his red work t-shirt with him. All in all, there were no signs that Jason planned to leave, and his parents believed that he was too responsible to have left without telling anyone. A friend of his echoed similar sentiments when she reported, "He loves his parents and his brother more than anything in the world. He'd be talking to me on the phone, and he'd put me on hold so that he could tuck his brother into bed. His family came first." Both authorities and Jason's family believe that he met with foul play on the day of his disappearance. Amateur sleuths have suggested that he was picked up by somebody he knew or lured inside a home, since CCTV showed that he never made it to the school, suggesting he was interrupted while walking there. Others have theorized his body was disposed of following a hit and run, or that he was approached for help by a neighbor with sinister intentions. Unfortunately, though, there are simply no clues in the case to indicate what became of the 19-year-old. In 2007, Jason's mother quoted an unnamed police sergeant who called the disappearance the most baffling case he has seen in 30 years. Jason's parents, Jim and Kelly, created a non-profit organization named Project Jason in the aftermath of their son's disappearance. The organization aims to provide assistance to the families of the missing. Similarly, they lobbied for Jason's Law, which was passed by the Nebraska legislature in 2005. The law birthed the creation of a statewide database for missing people. Kelly later received a Volunteer for Victims Award in 2010 and the Nebraska Governor's Points of Light Award in 2014, both in recognition for the work she has done to help support the families of missing people. As of 2024, Jason's case remains open and is still being investigated by Omaha PD, but there have been no new leads in the last 23 years. Friends and family marked the 20th anniversary of his disappearance in 2021 by gathering at a park. Kelly stated, "Unfortunately, with this mark, I will not have had him more years than I had him in my life since he disappeared at the age of 19. He was almost 20, but he was 19. That's hard to fathom. 20 years. That's 2 decades. She recalled one of the last times she spent time with him when they had supper with the rest of the family. We didn't really have a name for it, but it was kind of a who laughs first game. You would say one word and it was usually something silly. You would just see who would start laughing, and he was always the one who lost. We knew he had a tendency to start giggling." 19-year-old Jason was last seen on June 13, 2001, when he left his home in the area of 48th and Bedford Streets in Omaha, Nebraska. He is described as a white male with brown hair and brown eyes. He is 6'1" and was 160 pounds at the time of his disappearance. When he was last seen, he was wearing a white Chicago Cubs or Sammy Sosa t-shirt, a blue or black Chicago Cubs baseball cap, black dress trousers, and black dress shoes. He was carrying his red work t-shirt with him. His speech and language disability may make him seem more vulnerable than he is, and he also uses the nickname JJ. If Jason is still alive, he will be 43 this year. If you have any information about his disappearance, you can contact the Omaha Police Department at 402-444-5657. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own theories and speculations, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.